And we're live.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is the AIB meeting for today. Today is August the 10th, 2023. We have a rather full agenda for today. First of all, let's call the roll. And I would ask Executive Director Heiss to do so. Please do so at this time.
Sure. In addition to the chair, Vice Chair Kerwin is present, and members Lynch, Doss, Manco, Stapleton, and Robinson. So we have everyone present.
All right. Do we have anyone who signed up for questions or comments today?
For public comment? No, we do not.
Okay, all right. Today we'll have a series of briefings. One of the challenges we have is to try to get to as much of the information as we possibly can. And so we will entertain a number of questions from you that you may have about the presentation today. So feel free to ask whatever questions or make comments that you have, because I think following this meeting, I believe that the report may be finalized before the end. Is that correct, Executive Director?
You're referring to the college and career readiness study. The final report is due in September, correct?
Okay. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free today to take this opportunity to address the presenters in whatever form or fashion you think is appropriate. So I'd urge you to do so because we will not get at least another opportunity prior to that time. So with that, I'm to look to approve our last meeting's summary. Are there any additional changes or alterations to that meeting from August the 1st? Not out. If not,
approval.
thank you. There's a second to the motion for approval.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and properly second that we approve the summary of meetings from the August 1st meeting. Here, no additional comments or questions. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? Here none, the summary is so approved. At this point in time, we're going to start with our presentations. And I think I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director to lead us to the first presentation at this point in time. Will you please do so?
Sure. So the first item is a presentation discussion of the college and career readiness empirical study interim reports. We received 2 interim reports, one on the predictive validity study or the quantitative study, and one on the content and standards alignment study or the qualitative study. And we have with us today Dr. Duque from MSDE, who is going to make some opening comments and then turn it over to the researchers from American Institutes for Research.
Okay, let's get started.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Duque, Director of Research Planning and Program Evaluation at MSDE. I believe we have some slides to share. Let's see. So is Phil able to share?
Oops, I made you the co-host. Matt, I will make Phil.
Thank you. So while we're waiting, so we have the researchers from AIR joining us for the presentation. They're presenting the interim reports for both the predictive validity study and the content and standards alignment study that were released respectively in May and July of this year. As you noted, the final report is due to the Assembly, the Governor, as well as AIB by September 1st. Okay, so just to give you some background on this study before the researchers present, the blueprint calls for a clear definition of college and career readiness standard to ensure students are reaching their goals. It also required MSD to commission a research study to verify the CCR standard. So MSD has commissioned 2 separate studies. We presented the exploratory study to the AIB previously, Today, we're looking at the long-term study in which we contracted with the American Institutes for Research. Again, two parts of predictive validity study and the content and standards alignment analysis, which I'll go into a little bit more in the next slide. So there's a current CCR standard. We're calling it the interim standard. It was set in February of 2022 by the state board, and it's depending solely on test scores. So students, to meet the standard, must score at a certain level in English on the English 10 assessment, and then also in math. And there are 3 choices for students in terms of the math test that they must score on, for the Maryland assessment, and then there's also an option for the SAT. Next slide, please. So just a little context that in order to update the CCR standard, if we're going to revise it from the current one that you just saw, we need to complete this research study first, which we're very close to doing. But while it's being conducted, this interim standard is still in effect for funding, placement, etc. After the study is complete, the state board will look at the matter and adopt CCR standard, whether it's keeping the current one or revising it to a more effective, equitable measure. Next slide, please. So researchers will go into this, but I mentioned there are 2 parts of the study, and even within that, each of those, there are multiple components. So the quantitative study is going to look at the current standard and how valid it is in predicting students' post-secondary outcomes, and look at some possible other measures that could be used in a CCR standard. And then the content standards alignment study has multiple pieces. So in addition to alignment between high school learning standards and post-secondary expectations, they also looked at top performing educational systems and how they treat this idea of college and career readiness, as well as some states across the nation, pulled on perceptions from stakeholders in terms of how they view CCR and what they see in terms of their students being ready for college and workforce, as well as looking at potential sources of bias in these assessments. Next slide, please. So give you an overall timeline. This started with RFP in May of 2022 and reviewed 5 proposals. Eventually recommended American Institutes for Research, and that was approved in November of 2022. That allowed work to begin in December of last year with a kickoff meeting. Next slide, please. And since then, AR has submitted the first study in May, was presented to the State Board of Education. The second study, the qualitative study, recently in July, again, presented to the State Board. And as I mentioned before, the final report is due shortly. So to give you a reminder / overview of the predictive validity study, the interim report focused on students who attended a Maryland public high school in grade 10 between years 2015 and 2019 and attended a Maryland college or university in the year after their high school graduation. And the 2 high-level findings from that interim report was that compared to the interim CCR standard, an alternative standard that includes high school grade point average as a measure as an additional way for students to meet the standard would increase the percentage of students who met the standard from 40% to 64%. And additionally, that high school GPA option would also increase the accuracy rate, or the percentage of students who are correctly classified as either college ready or not college ready, from 65% using the interim standard to 75% using this option with GPA.
I have a question, if I could. Could I have?
Sure, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to be sure I understand this. You talked about the increase from 40 to 64% in terms of determining students who met the standard, and then your second bullet there, the increase in the percentage who were correctly classified. But at the end of the day, at most 75% of the students were correctly classified. Is that correct? By using these two measures.
Yes.
So, I mean, for someone who, to me, that seems unacceptably low. We want 25% of our students to be incorrectly classified. So, what is your thought about where are we trying to get to with the predictive index? Wouldn't we want to be able to say we're classifying 80 or 90 or 95% of our students correctly?
So I think, so one is recognize we will not hit 100%.
Right.
And it's really hard to answer that with a straight number. I think if you don't mind, if we can hold off and they will go through the study with more detail.
Yeah.
And they will offer, they're going to offer a rule of thumb. So
okay. Well, okay. Now I will wait, but on the surface, it bothers me that we would have such a large number of students incorrectly classified. Something's wrong if that's the case. The other thing I don't quite understand about the language is that another way to meet that they were who were correctly classified as college ready or not college ready. So say a bit more. Are you saying that of the students who were deemed college ready, then let's say there were 64% when you use the grade point average, that of those 64%, 65 to 75% were correctly classified as ready or not? I don't quite understand the ready or not.
Yeah, so again, I think once we get into the study, they'll explain that more, but think about like true positives and false negatives. So there are really 4 outcomes. It's how you're classified and how you actually perform. So the accuracy rate there are 2 categories: correct prediction. Either you're correctly predicted as ready or correctly predicted as not ready based on the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But I think our researchers have some slides showing that probably in a better way.
Thank you.
Sure. Next slide, please. And then we want to share some of the stakeholder engagement we've done so far. So it was really, we divided into 4 phases. There was before the study started, both MSD and the AIR researchers held some office hours for stakeholders to get input on the study and ask questions on the direction of the study. And that included the Maryland Higher Education Commission, Association of Community Colleges, as well as the University System of Maryland. The second part of engagement was during the study, AIR conducted focus groups. And in the qualitative portion, they'll get more into these, but there were 8 focus groups in total covering post-secondary workforce as well as K-12 stakeholders to get their input and perceptions on college and career readiness. Next slide. The third phase of the engagement is after each of the interim reports. With AIR, MSD has held listening sessions to present these just like we're doing today and get their input and questions. So it spanned everything from the chief academic officers within LEAs, different higher education officials across all segments of higher education in Maryland, specifically the Maryland Association of Community College Presidents, and along with the Maryland Higher Education Commission leadership. Additional briefings are scheduled with the governor's office, as well as the superintendents of the LEAs and another group of presidents of community colleges. And just to note that the last phase is then following the release of the final report. We'll continue these listening sessions with higher ed, K-12, and stakeholders. Next slide. With that, I'll turn it over to our AIR partners. I believe Jordan's going to lead off.
Great, thanks. And so, or is Phil going to be running the slides, or should I share my screen?
Phil is running. So.
Okay, great, thank you. So, yes, thanks for that setup, and thanks to the board for letting us present today. We're going to primarily focus on highlighting again the preliminary findings from the 2 interim reports that we completed already as part of the study. And here's just a quick overview of what we plan to cover during our time today. Because most of you already saw our presentation on the interim predictive validity analysis report back in May, we'll go over that piece relatively quickly so we can spend more time on the content and standards alignment analysis. But mainly we're here to answer your questions, so feel free. If we go over something too quickly, we're happy to answer questions and circle back. Next slide. So I think Matt pretty much covered this, but here's again just a quick reminder. We have these 2 pieces of the overall study, the predictive validity analysis and the content and standards alignment analysis. We've produced an interim report on both of those so far. And then we're working to finalize that report right now, the final report right now, that brings both pieces together and should have that by September 1st. So we can go, starting with the predictive validity analysis. I'll just give you a quick overview of the approach before jumping into the findings. And again, I'll go over this relatively quickly for time, but again, want to make sure we address any questions that you have. So first, we had to determine which students to include in the analysis. And so for the interim report, we focused on students who attended a Maryland high school in 10th grade and attended a Maryland college or university after high school graduation. And we considered that our main student group of interest. And then second, we had to determine which high school measures of college and career readiness to examine. And so for the interim report, we focused on measures that are part of the interim CCR standard, as well as looking at high school GPA and PSAT scores. You can go to the next slide. And so in terms of the student sample, we included 5 student cohorts in the study, and those are defined based on the year they entered high school and their expected high school graduation year. So our main focus was on the students, again, who were in a Maryland public high school at the end of their 2nd year. And that's what should be their grade 10 year. And that's what's highlighted in the green boxes here on the slide. And then if you go to the next slide, we followed these students through what should be their first post-secondary year. And that's what the gold boxes highlight there. We can go on to the next, yep, great. So in that first post-secondary year, we defined an initial post-secondary pathway for each student based on where they were in that fall semester after their expected high school graduation year. And we classified students into one of 6 pathways. Only a handful of students were in the non-Maryland 2-year college pathway. So we aren't showing that pathway here and don't really include it in our analyses. And just over half the students attended some type of college in the fall after their 4th year of high school. So if you go to the next slide, yeah, I just want everybody to keep in mind that the main analysis, predictive validity analysis, is focused on students who attended a Maryland college because that's where we have credit and GPA information. And a little over a third of students in our grade 10 sample went on to attend a Maryland college that fall after their 4th year of high school.
I have a real quick question. As was stated earlier, the Blueprint College and Career Ready standard is that students can, if they're college and career ready, they can take an entry-level community college course without remediation. So I'm curious that you included public 4 years and private 4 years in this study, because the standard isn't based on what happens to them in entry-level courses.
Right, but the standard will be applied to all students at grade 10. So we wanted to make sure that we first capture as many students as we possibly can, and then we break down our results, to look at specifically what happens with students that went on to a community college, for example.
So you do,
We do break it down, definitely.
Disaggregate. Okay, thank you.
All right, we want, because it's applied to all students, we also want to see what
Okay.
it would mean for those students too. Right, so then we, again, sought to examine the predictive validity of the interim CCR standard, which again includes performance on English and math tests. And then we tested 3 alternative versions of the CCR standard. For each of these alternatives, a student could meet the standard based on what's in the interim CCR standard or in some different way. And so that first alternative is they can meet the standard either based on what's already in the interim or having a composite PSAT score of at least 1,000. The second alternative is they can meet the standard based on what's in the interim or having an overall GPA of 3.0 or higher. And then that third alternative is the students can meet the standard either based on what's in the interim, based on scoring, having a PSAT score of at least 1,000, or having a high school GPA of at least 3.0. And all of these are defined at the end of the student's second year of high school. And these slides, if there's still questions about that, these slides provide a visual of what each of those different versions of the standard mean, but I think we can skip through them in the sake of time, unless there are questions. And we can always come back to those too. So to assess the predictive validity of the standards, we had to compare them to how students actually did in their entry-level post-secondary coursework. And so this required us to define what it means to make adequate post-secondary progress. And so for the interim standard, we examined 2 measures of progress, the number of college credits accumulated in that first year, and then college GPA in the first year. For the final report, we do dig down into completing or getting credits in specific entry-level coursework, specifically math, English, and science. But we did not have that information ready for the interim report. So for credit, sure, we can go, okay. Yes, yeah. For credit accumulation, we looked at earning at least 12 credits or at least 15 credits in that first semester. And then we also looked at earning at least 24 or at least 30 credits over the first 2 semesters combined. And then for GPA, we looked at benchmarks of 2.0, 2.5, and 3.0. And then for the ease of presentation, we'll focus primarily on progress in that first fall semester, and particularly whether the students earned at least 12 credits or whether students met the GPA 2.0 benchmark.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's a question.
Okay,
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Dr. Rickles, thank you. I just had a quick question. You mentioned, and I was very glad to hear it, that your final analysis was looking at performance in specific entry-level classes, because I think that speaks toward, and I'm glad because that speaks toward I think the intent. As we're listening to your findings in the interim report, are there any that, I know we're 3 weeks away from you giving out the final report, could you just plan to highlight anything that might be in conflict or that is maybe not a finding that you're going to stick with just as you go through? Sure.
And I think it's safe to say nothing in the final report conflicts what we're presenting here. We look at more in the final report is what we do. And in looking at more, there's going to be a few places where things don't line up exactly, but the overall story, the overall conclusions, I think what's reflected here are what are reflected in the additional analyses.
Great, thank you.
Right, so with the CCR standards and different post-secondary progress benchmarks defined, we conducted a classification analysis to see how well the CCR standard could correctly classify students as college ready or not college ready. And so with this approach, students are classified into one of 4 groups, which is depicted in that little graphic on the right. So the 2 blue boxes in the graphic are when the CCR standard correctly classifies students, and then the two gray boxes represent when the CCR standard misclassifies students. The accuracy rate, which is what we'll focus on mostly in the presentation, is the combination of those two blue boxes. And so I think to the question that was asked earlier,
very helpful.
yeah.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Right. And so we do look at other metrics, that the sensitivity and specificity rates, which look at how well, if you just look at the students that truly did make post-secondary progress, how well does the standard do at correctly identifying them? And then of the students that truly do not make progress, how well does the standard do correctly identifying those students? But the accuracy rate kind of gives a summary. And so for the sake of time, we'll focus on that.
Incidentally, do you know the numbers of students in each of these boxes?
Well, we do. We don't have them presented here. We do have some of that information that will be in the final report. And then we are working on putting together a supplemental document that really provides all the
I
information.
think that would be helpful to know. I mean, for example, are there a lot of true negatives?
Right. Yeah, so that's actually one of the things we can talk about. There's a lot of false negatives for the interim standard, and that's what's going to be driving some of the accuracy rates that you see.
I mean, excuse me, I meant, I'd like to know how many false negatives are.
Right.
That was really the issue. Yeah, thank you.
And we did present some of that in the May board meeting. We did go into detail about what percentages were in each of those boxes. So if you look back at the materials from the May State Board of Education meeting, those numbers are in there.
Dr. Reckles, I assume this falls outside of the scope of what you were planning on doing, but was this extrapolated out actually for looking at 6-year graduation rates? So actually what was the final outcome, not just college and career readiness, but actually if they were able to persist and complete successfully all the way through to graduation?
College graduation is what you're speaking. No, we did not. It did fall a little bit outside the scope. We wanted to focus in on that first year in particular because of what's in the blueprint there. Yeah, so now we can go a little bit into the findings. So what's presented here is really what we consider the two biggest takeaways from the interim report, which has to do with the potential benefit of including high school GPA in the CCR standard instead of just having the criteria that's in the interim standard. So if we just look at the first two bars at the top there, this is showing what percentage of students meet the standard at the end of grade 10. And so we can see that with the interim standard, 40% of students meet standard. And then if we include the option to meet with the high school GPA of at least 3.0, that increases to 64% meeting the standard. And then if we look at the bottom two bars, that's looking at the accuracy rate, how the accuracy rate changes going from the interim standard, where it's 65%, to up to 75% when we include that option for high school GPA.
So could you comment on the question I raised earlier? I mean, should anybody be satisfied even with a 75% accuracy rate?
So this is where, right, so there aren't specific rules for what constitutes a good accuracy rate. 70% is often thrown out, but if you're talking about a high stakes decision, you'd want that rate to be much higher. And you also have to take into account kind of what are the costs and benefits of misclassifying a student as ready when they really aren't versus classifying them as not ready when they really are. So there are some societal values that need to be placed onto that decision. That makes it difficult to give a firm answer there, but
Thank you.
I think there's a question.
Sure.
Dr. Rick,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just go
Sorry,
ahead.
Go ahead, Member Doss. Yeah.
Thank you. When we're talking about the high school GPA, was there any work in the study done that actually looked at the impact or the potential impact that GPA could have on actually predicting readiness?
You say a little more about the impact that it could have?
Could have impact as far as when we're talking about grade inflation? Could it have impact, or was anything done to look at the potential impact that it could have on the validity of the GPA or course grades and predicting readiness?
So, I mean, the impact we're showing here is that it'll improve, or on average, it'll improve, including it would make the prediction better. What we can't do is predict the future of, if this becomes a formal accountability criterion, what that means for how people could manipulate or change GPA. That's something we can't predict. In the final report, we do provide information on just how much the predictive power of high school GPA differs across LEAs and schools, to try to get a sense of, to what extent is high school GPA an unstandardized measure? To what extent does it really differ across different contexts and conditions? So we do try to dig into high school GPA a little bit, but again, we can't really predict what actors will do if this becomes, a formal accountability measure.
Okay.
I just wanted to amplify something that Dr. Rickles just mentioned about the accuracy rate and how that actually differs from something that's called sensitivity and specificity. Whereas sensitivity is the percentage of students who are actually CCR ready, that are deemed to be CCR ready by this threshold or whatever metric we're using. And so as that threshold moves and gets, we call it less stringent, we're going to have better rates, or more percentages of students who are really truly CCR ready will be identified to be CCR ready. Alternately, though, as you move that threshold, specificity gets worse. So we will not be identifying people who are not college and career ready. And so any decision that is made by MSDE, the state, is going to have to balance decisions about sensitivity and specificity. And what's more important, if it's set very high, then we may limit students who have the potential to do quite well from those post-CCR pathways. But if we set it high, again, we will perhaps provide more support for more students who are not CCR ready. So I just wanted to highlight that that's an important distinction and the balancing of those two different metrics, because there's a choice to be made there.
Member Manco?
Yeah. What was the GPA threshold that this analysis was set at? Was it at 3.0 and then
3.0?
And then as you adjusted either upwards or downwards, looked at 3.2 or 2.8 or 2.6, like did the accuracy increase, decrease, or you found that 3.0 was actually the optimal spot where we would have the highest amount of positive cases and the lowest amount of negatives?
3.0, so we did look at, in the interim report, in an appendix somewhere, we show how the sensitivity and specificity rates change as you move that GPA threshold up or down. Again, it's 3.0 is about where it seemed optimal, and we stuck with 3.0 because at 3.0 because it would seem odd to recommend something like 3.15 or something like that, but or 2.87. But so it seemed to be right around 3.0. I will add, in the final report, we do a more advanced analysis where we use machine learning approach to kind of let the algorithms pick the optimal points, and just to spoil a finding there. It's right. It's actually amazing right around 3.0 is where the computer is telling us it should be too.
I mean, and then I guess the other question goes to what Dr. Kerwin was getting at, which is, are there other measures that either could be based on your exploration of this, any other measures that could be added or subtracted from the equation that would help get the that 75% rate closer to 100%?
So so definitely not, well, so we threw a lot of different possible measures, both in the machine learning analysis, as well as kind of us just manually trying to come up with different logical combinations. Once high school GPA is in there as an option, throwing in additional other things doesn't seem to gain you much. You might get a percentage point here or there, but the complexity that it's adding into, the kind of opaqueness that it's adding into the standard, it doesn't necessarily seem worth it. This is based on existing measures we have in the data, existing measures.
Was there any analysis done on attendance, or is that was excluded?
We did include attendance in an analysis, though we tried to shy away from highlighting it due to concerns about kind of, around equity and how that might be applied. I do want to make sure we save time for the other pieces of the study too, but I'm again happy to answer questions. Maybe we can we want to skip ahead. Let's see. Let's go to the next slide here. All right, now Max, happy to answer any questions. This additional question.
Let me ask, and I'm going to put it in a more straightforward format, because I'm thinking there's a disconnect between the GPA, the scores that they receive on appropriate testing and other measures that you look at to predict college success, and the number of students who ultimately have to take remedial coursework, because that number is pretty high. But going back to Board Member Curran's question, if we look at the number of students who are deemed to be college and career ready, that's a pretty high number looking at the various matrices that you've outlined. But when you look at what actually happens in terms of remedial coursework, there seemed to be a higher number. So if that number was much more predictable, then there should be a correlation between those two. And in my opinion, you would not have as many students taking as much in terms of remediation. Now, the way you could look at it is a simple way. Let's take a baseball analogy. If you had a number of players playing in the minor league, say the AAA league, and a player hits 35 home runs in the minor league, they stole 20 bases and batted 300, then our prediction is that that player would be a success and make it to the major leagues. Until we categorize all of those players who hit that matrix. They hit 35 home runs, they batted 300, they stole 20 bases. But actually, when those number of players got to the minor league, overwhelming number of those got to the major leagues was sent back to the minor leagues because they couldn't cut it. So either one or two things happened. That analogy of 35 home runs, 300 batting average, 20 stolen bases was not a good measure. Or when they played in the minor leagues, they played against substandard pitching and inadequate defense. And there's a reflection of a number that does not provide you the predictability. So I have this in sort of a layman's term, but please correct me or direct me where I may be wrong or correct in that analysis.
Well, let me try. So sticking with the analogy for a second, it
Mhm.
could be that we're maybe on base percentage is a useful metric that you did not include in there. And so by not taking that into account, we ended up misclassifying how well some of those players would do. We also missed all the pitchers. Maybe the pitchers don't have the great batting average, but they have other metrics that we haven't taken into account that make them successful. And so I think part of it is we're dealing with a limited set of metrics when we're talking about students at the end of 10th grade. And because of that, there's going to be some misclassification.
Yeah, but going back to what is presented, based on the analysis, there's a high correlation on grade point averages and the test scores at the end of 10th grade. But once you've gotten to the actual college level, a disproportionate number of those students are still in remediation. So one or two things happen. We didn't do a good job in the minor leagues of putting in the things that should be properly evaluated. And our matrix are somewhat off kilter because you should not have that great a disparity.
Right. That can be the other, just to throw one other option out there is how students are being deemed for developmental courses or credit bearing courses could be off kilter too.
So would we have to have that into the equation? The coursework that they've taken, or we have not evaluated that appropriately?
Well, that I think is a little outside of this study.
If you've got a 3-point average, does it suggest, I think you have some limited information on math and reading, right? Is there something that's missing in terms of the qualitative information that provided that grade point average?
Oh, I'm certain there is. Yes. We're only able to work with what data are available, and we'd always want more data, more detailed information.
Okay. Well, thank you for your response on the on-base percentage.
No, sure. No, that's fun. And just to point out, just quickly on this slide, if we do focus in on the Maryland community colleges, which is the third row here, this is the percentage of students that went on to a Maryland community college. This is the percentage who did meet the standard at the end of 10th grade. And so 27% met the interim standard. And then 49% met alternative 2 is the standard with high school GPA. And so you're still seeing that there's a lot of students not meeting the standard. Over half of the students don't meet standard alternative 2 for the students that go on to a community college. And so that does align with a lot of students being, put into developmental coursework.
Yeah, but when you go back and look at those in 4-year institutions, especially the private institutions they're in, there's a selection or admission process that is highly different between those and community colleges. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and that, yes.
Corinne?
Yes, and part of that has to do with, some of these, there's admissions criteria for, a lot of the 4-year colleges that will create selective, the students that are attending a community college are on average different than the students that attend a 4-year institution. So that is factoring in here. And then just on the next slide.
I do have a question. I'm sorry, before we move on, just a clarifying question on the previous slide. So for the students in the community college who went to community college and they met, I'm sorry, the next slide over. And they met the standard, but it doesn't account for students who met the standard but were still placed in developmental classes or remedial classes.
So this is just showing what percentage of the students met the standard.
Okay.
That's all we're showing here, just to be clear.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And the next slide, we get at the accuracy rates broken out by the different post-secondary pathways. And just the main thing to highlight here for the sake of time is that going from the interim standard to a standard that includes high school GPA, and there's two different versions here on the right, we see the accuracy rates increase. Not so much so for community colleges when we look at predicting 12 credits or more. But if you go to the next slide, if we look at whether students had a college GPA of at least 2.0, we see that for all sectors, there's a meaningful increase in the accuracy rates when adding in high school GPA as an option. And so I think, and then in the reports, we break this down by different student groups. We break it down by different regions of the state. And so we have a lot more information both in the interim report, as well as there'll be a lot more information in the final report too.
So this is reporting on the two blue boxes from.
That's correct. That's a combination of the two blue. And
Could you explain again the community college numbers again? What that reflects, please?
sure. So in this figure here, this table,
The 2 year.
so if we look at the Maryland community colleges or the public 2-year, if we are to use the interim standard, 51% of the students who attended a community college were correctly classified as college ready or not college ready. If we were to include high school GPA in the standard, which is that alternative 2, 64% of the students that went on to a community college will be correctly classified as college ready or not college ready.
Well, see, this is the question that I was posing earlier. Because that does not reflect the same analysis that we have in terms of remediation. You're telling me that 64% of those students in the community college, which is the one that are not self-selected or highly selected as in the other schools, would not need levels of remediation. And that does not.
No, so it's a little different because this gets back to the other question about whether we're combining the two blue boxes. So this is combining those two blue boxes, which is the students that should not need developmental coursework, plus the students that do. So yeah, thank you. So it's the top right box, the true positive. Those are the students that really do not, that really should be in the first year credit bearing coursework. They do not need the developmental coursework. Really, it's the two top boxes.
Put that up. I don't have it. Go back to the chart. To the boxes.
The ones here. We can it might be best. We have another graphic that we showed in the State Board of Education presentation that might speak to this better. And so it might be useful to go through the rest of the study and then circle back, and maybe I could show that other box.
Okay.
I think it would be
All right.
another graphic that would be more helpful. Yeah.
Thank you.
But there is some nuance there that I think is worth digging into. We'll skip over this and let's go on to the next. So I'll turn over to Jessica Mason to talk about the other part of the study.
Jordan, and thanks everyone for having us here. If you go on to the next slide, I can go through this pretty quickly. Matt did introduce this when he was describing the study earlier, but just quickly, we had 4 main components to the content and standards alignment analysis. We first did focus groups and follow-up surveys with Maryland post-secondary faculty, workforce representatives, and K-12 leaders. We asked about their perspectives on student course readiness and also how they design their courses. To explore how other top performing education systems approach college and career readiness, and to identify potential sources of bias in CCR assessments, we did a landscape analysis and a literature review. Next slide, please. We also use publicly available information on community college websites to conduct an inventory of course requirements for first-year credit-bearing and developmental English and math courses, as well as first-year credit-bearing science courses at all of Maryland's community colleges. We followed that with a programmatic survey to collect syllabi and learning objectives for those courses and to solicit feedback from community college faculty on their perspectives on student readiness for college. The last piece was standards alignment and gap analysis to identify areas of alignment and misalignment between Maryland's K-12 content standards and post-secondary content expectations. So the first thing I'll talk about is the stakeholder engagement component of the work. So this is the focus groups and the programmatic survey. So given the community colleges provide a large share of the entry level and developmental courses to Maryland students, we focused on the community colleges for a representative picture of entry level and developmental courses in the state. We worked with MHEC to distribute the survey invitation to the presidents of all 16 community colleges, and they in turn distributed the survey to faculty, administrators, and department chairs, primarily to respond. On the next slide, we have a little bit about kind of the representation in the focus groups. So we engaged key stakeholders from post-secondary education and focus groups. We also included stakeholders from workforce and K-12 to gather additional input to inform sort of a common understanding of post-secondary readiness expectations from multiple perspectives. We did a total of 8 focus groups with a total of 41 participants, and you can see the breakdown here on the slide. And on the next slide, we have a breakdown of the post-secondary focus group participation. So you can see community colleges had the greatest representation, followed by public four-year and state independent. And I think it may have been one of you on this call who asked a question on an earlier presentation about geographic representation. And we did go back and look at the participating colleges, and they do represent kind of diverse geographical areas across the state.
That was me. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. Okay, so on the next slide, we're already on it. Okay, thank you. So preliminary findings from our syllabi review and review of kind of the content of those syllabi suggest that the primary content emphases in each content area and course type. So broadly, we're seeing that the emphasis in English leans heavily toward writing skills, and the content emphasis in math is primarily algebra. And then in science, there's a focus on scientific method and communication, which is all consistent with what we learned through the focus groups. Dr. Kerwin, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So in doing the content analysis, were the course syllabi a primary source of information to determining the content?
Yes.
A question I have about that is, I've taught math courses for decades, and I've written a lot of course syllabi. And the course syllabi emphasize what the student will learn in that course.
Mm-hmm.
They don't emphasize what the student is expected to know when they come to that course.
That's correct.
So that's what seems missing here to me. By relying heavily on the syllabi, are you really getting at what it is that students are expected to know when they start the course? So for example, you've got down here algebra, functions, quantity, geometry, and statistics. Well, what about geometry should they be expected to know in order to be successful in the course? Or what about, are they supposed to know regression analysis or not when they do statistics? So what seems missing to me, and it may have been done, so I'm not saying it wasn't, but what seems missing to me from information being given to me is, has there been a deep dive on what students should be able to do when they enter the course, as opposed to what the content of the course is that they will learn if they are successful in the course?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we will, I think, touch on this a bit when we move on to the findings from the alignment analysis, but I think your question is a good one and maybe slightly outside of the scope of what we were doing. But I think the idea here is that we were trying to align the CCR standard, which if it is, correctly identifying students, in theory, that is telling us what the students should know and be able to do in order to be ready for those college classes. And so when we do the alignment, what we do is a much more detailed look at within algebra, what all kinds of pieces of this. So the CCR standards are broken down into very
Right.
specific components. So we look at all of those to see which of those are represented in these classes or not. And so we can speak to that question a little bit, but I think there could be a
Can I add
separate.
one thing to that?
Yeah, I just
Mhm,
wanted
please.
to mention that, and this is not about you. You did what you were asked to do, so I'm not raising any questions about that. But the language in the blueprint is that the CCR study is to analyze ELA and math expectations. What should students know? And I just don't think you can get that from a course syllabi. So
We do also, I think we complement the syllabi findings with what we learned from the post-secondary stakeholders directly in the focus groups, which adds a lot of color, I think, to beyond just simple content knowledge, what else students should know and be able to do in order to be prepared for college. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And Jordan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I didn't want to bring up the focus groups, and that's where we get some of this information, but also want to emphasize our look at developmental coursework at the college level. There is an expectation there that the developmental courses, what's on their syllabi, is what should be getting students ready for the first year credit bearing coursework. So you're right to point out we need to be careful when we interpret some of the alignment study findings, but the developmental coursework is where I would place my bet.
I like that point. I think that's a very good point. What we need to do is to ensure that the material in the developmental course is being taught in the post-second in the high schools, and that would make the tie-in if the developmental work is actually being taught in the high schools, and we won't have a real alignment until we can be assured of that fact, in my opinion.
Yep, thank you. And I think that not to spoil anything too much here, but I think that we do find that in general, there is alignment between what's taught in the high school courses and what is reflected in those syllabi and developmental courses. And some of the focus group findings, which we'll get into now, kind of shed light on why students still may not be ready. So on this slide, thank you. This is just some findings from the programmatic survey. So we asked stakeholders to respond to questions asking them about what proportion of their students at entry did they think were college ready. So you can see that the responses suggest that ELA readiness is stronger. So more than half of the respondents thought that more than 81% of their students were college ready in English language, whereas less than a quarter thought that that same percentage, 81 or more of their students were college ready in algebra. Now I will get into some of the high level takeaways from the focus groups. I think this will.
Question, who gave that response?
Those were faculty administrators. They were the respondents to the programmatic survey. And so the college presidents distributed.
At where?
I'm sorry?
Faculty administrators where?
At the community colleges.
Okay.
Okay. So focus group findings. One important theme was that kind of consistent with what we found in the survey, many students don't appear college ready in reading, writing, pre-calculus, and scientific thought, which are areas that can really set them back when they start college. So in particular, English stakeholders shared that students struggled in critical reading and writing. Math and science stakeholders were concerned about students' readiness for entry-level courses, especially in terms of scientific thinking and algebra. on the next slide, we have some findings related to sort of non-academic skills and supports. And so I think this gets to our question about the minor leagues preparing someone to be successful. And this may be one reason why even if students meet the standard, they're still struggling. And I see a hand, Member Robinson.
You're on mute.
You're on mute though.
You're not on mute, but we cannot hear you. Yeah, type it in the chat. Okay.
All right, we'll look out for that. Thank you. In the meantime, I can talk through some of these findings to just in the interest of time. So focus group participants from post-secondary noted the importance of these broader non-academic skills like self-direction, time management, critical thinking, also social emotional learning. Workforce stakeholders similarly said that these skills are crucial for success in the workplace, and they're developed through internships and work experience. We also heard about a need for wraparound services, especially to support the development of those skills, which can really be a source of inequity for students despite being correctly placed into courses. They also talked about the importance of understanding other factors that affect student success in placement tests and placement into courses like balancing family and work responsibilities, managing disabilities, and noted that these were things that became more pronounced during the pandemic. Focus group participants also pointed to the importance of using multiple measures to assess readiness, especially given this conversation about non-academic skills being a source of inequity in those assessments. Stakeholders reflected on varied levels of preparation and educational opportunity that their students have, in addition to noting that even though students may meet content standards, they're not necessarily ready for post-secondary coursework. And now I'm going to pop back to the chat to look at the question. Curious if we want to know if students are college and career ready, how can this component be measured? This may account for that other 25% of students incorrectly classified, but how do we measure this? Any ideas? So how do we measure those non-academic skills? Yeah, it's a great question. And if any of my colleagues would like to share any thoughts as well. I mean, I think one thing is to highlight this is not a measurement piece, but to highlight the importance of supports that help students develop those skills. I mean, I think a lot of these kinds of skills are often measured through student self-reporting, measuring or looking at behaviors in terms of like self-direction, behaviors and student self-reports on kind of how they manage time. So that's not a great, if we're talking about high stakes measurement, that's not a great option. But it's a really important question that I would, think we should look into further.
I'm going to jump in. I have a feeling that the success of GPA, adding that into the equation to predict CCR readiness or not, probably is a proxy for some of those skills. And I don't know if that's can be disentangled. Is it worth it to disentangle that? But that's just where my thoughts are right now.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Jordan, I think that's a point that we make in the final report, if I'm not wrong.
I agree with that, what was said. It's probably one of the reasons adding high school GPA is improves the accuracy rates. I think there's still a case to be made if we were to have better measures of these, I think we call it skills for success, then we could have an even better accuracy rate. But I think that might be that certain factors that allow students to get good grades translate over into having students get good grades in college above and beyond content knowledge.
Remind me, if was the greater accuracy with assessment and GPA or assessment or GPA?
It's or is it? Yeah.
It gives better accuracy.
Right, so they can
Okay.
meet, yeah,
Yeah,
either way, either
one or
with
the
the
other.
test
Okay.
scores or with the GPA.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in here. With the recommendations from the stakeholders, with their multiple measures and so forth, was there any worth noting? Anything that they recommended as far as alternative measures, multiple measures?
That's a great question. I don't remember hearing them suggest anything specific. But I might ask my colleague Lauren on the line if she remembers anything from the focus groups. to that.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. GPA was definitely elevated as something that we should be discussing.
Okay. Thank you.
Was there an exploration around the efficacy of GPA as just a standalone measure without the interim standard?
That's a good question. We did not, I think everything we looked at, we started with the interim standard and only added to it. So the short answer is no, but with the or, because it's an or,
Yeah.
either or,
You did or, so it
yeah.
included only
it
GPA.
doesn't hurt, yeah, to include.
Thanks everyone for the questions. I think we can move on. Our next two sections are brief and just in the interest of time, I will go through them quickly just to talk about the top performing education system. So we looked at some baseline performance metrics and we worked with MSDE to identify Colorado, Connecticut, and Massachusetts as focal states, and Estonia, Germany, Japan, and Singapore as focal countries to look into how they prepare students for college and career. On the next slide, we have a key commonality between the three focal states is that they provide formal CCR counseling to students via an easily accessible career plan starting in or before grade 10. And we have a few examples here on the slide. On the next slide, we have some takeaways from the top performing countries. I do want to just note quickly that drawing comparisons between Maryland or any US state with other countries' education systems is really challenging, just given fundamental differences like country size, cultural norms, education systems, and how they're set up. So just keeping that in mind, first we see vocational and technical tracks are often among several options for upper secondary school, and those programs are regulated centrally. Also for these countries, post-secondary readiness consists of both academic and non-academic skills. And so students in these countries to move on and succeed beyond high school, they have to master competencies related to character, values, critical thinking, collaboration. On the next slide, we will move into a quick look at what we found regarding potential sources of bias in assessments. So we did a literature review to examine existing research on the topic. We also spoke with folks in our focus groups to get their perspectives here. So two main takeaways. Standardized assessments are frequently subject to cultural bias. This is well documented. It's mostly attributed to language used in the test, which is norm to background knowledge often held by white middle-class students. In addition, post-secondary stakeholders spoke a lot about the opportunity gap for students in less resource districts. So recognizing that those students may not receive advice about college preparation and pathways that is consistent with what students in more resource districts are getting. This is also consistent with existing research. And so I will now turn it over to Lauren to speak about the alignment and gap analysis.
Thank you so much for having us this afternoon. Really appreciate the questions. Before I talk about the alignment analysis, I just wanted to respond, Member Robinson, on your question about measurement and social emotional learning. There are districts and schools that are experimenting with measurement of social emotional learning, not to use for high stakes purposes, but as an indicator of student readiness. So there is research on that in AIR. Some AIR staff have involvement in research in that area. And then Member Irwin, really appreciate your comments about readiness and and what a syllabus can and cannot tell us. In the alignment analysis, we don't go into this in the interim report. However, for the final report, we do break out the rigor of the alignment, both for the developmental courses and the first year credit bearing courses. So there will be a lot of interesting information that I think answers some of your questions in the final report. On the alignment analysis, before we go into it in depth, I'd just like to share some quick context. First, this study only looked at the content expectations of whether what students are expected to know and be able to do, as outlined in the Maryland College and Career Ready Standards, aligns to the post-secondary expectations of what students are expected to know. Was that a question? It did not look at the extent to which students are actually meeting the expectations, and standards are just one component of readiness, and they don't reflect instruction, supports, and other inputs of readiness. Second, the focus of the alignment study, which is high school standards to college expectations, isn't apples to apples. Maryland's college and career ready academic standards are specific, detailed, scaffolded to reflect the learning progressions across grade levels, and used by all schools in Maryland to guide curriculum and instruction. There is no post-secondary parallel. There's no common set of standards or expectations that are articulated, written down, and used consistently across colleges. So underlying our alignment process was this need to identify and summarize what those content expectations were across colleges. Next slide, please. I'll point out the high-level takeaways that are reflected in this interim report and then go into more details regarding the alignment methodology. First, looking at high school ELA standards, the standards identified for students to meet at the end of grade 10 align to the content expectations of post-secondary course content in developmental ELA and first-year credit-bearing ELA courses. And looking at high school math standards in general, high school math standards align with post-secondary expectations. Next slide, please. First, let's look at the Maryland K-12 content standards we included in the analysis. ELA, we looked at all 42 grade 9 and 10 standards across the 5 strands of the ELA standards. In addition to the ELA standards, we also looked at the disciplinary literacy standards as part of the review for science and certificate granting training programs. For math, the blueprint outlines multiple potential math pathways for students to meet the CCR standard by grade 10, all of which include either Algebra 1, Algebra 2, or Geometry. We also included statistics in the review since the number of students who enroll in college statistics courses as their first-year credit-bearing course is substantial. We also looked at the mathematical practices to inform the review of the certificate granting training programs. And for science, the disciplinary core ideas for life science and physical science are most applicable to content expectations for the required post-secondary general education science requirement. We also looked at the science and engineering practices to inform the review of certificate granting training programs. Next slide, please. Our next step, excuse me, was to identify the post-secondary courses to include in the analysis and to use to develop the conceptual frameworks. The course inventory we conducted identified 241 courses that met the initial criteria of developmental English or math, or first-year credit-bearing English, math, or science. Of those identified, we received 144 unique course syllabi through the survey that Jessica described. Course expectations reflected in the syllabi for these courses vary across the colleges. For ELA, Maryland's general education requirements for public institutions specifies English composition as meeting the ELA requirements. So the framework is focused on the common content found across the general first-year courses in those areas. For math, we used courses that provided foundational knowledge of key concepts for general education students, so non-math majors, and ones that had no prerequisites. For science, Maryland's general education requirements for public institutions specifies biological and physical sciences as meeting the science requirements. So the framework is focused on the common content found across general first-year courses in those areas. And then for certificate granting training programs, we looked at the top certificate programs identified by the MACC Workforce Training Dashboard. Next slide, please. This slide describes the general process for the alignment analysis. So these materials were generated. These materials were then used to ground the alignment process. Reviewers considered the available materials. They then determined a rating for the content alignment and the rigor, and then wrote a rationale for their rating. And then subsequently, AIR staff reviewed the ratings by the reviewers, aggregated those ratings, conducted analysis, and wrote up the findings for the alignment work. There were some adaptations to this process for science and certificate granting courses. However, the general process was the same. Next slide. So I'll go into the preliminary findings, next slide, but before we share some of the findings, I'd like to talk about how to interpret the findings. There are three general categories that alignment findings could fall into, which provide context to the findings. First, we have the center category. So looking in the center, high school standards that align or partially align. What does that mean? Again, we're looking at both content and rigor. So for content, standards that are aligned for content typically had shared language or expectations with the course objectives from the course syllabi. Standards that were partially aligned for content demonstrated an implied relationship between the high school standards and college expectations, or alternatively, the college expectations did not address all parts of the high school standard. A partially aligned rating was also assigned when the college expectations assumed but would not explicitly mention the knowledge and skills listed in the high school standard. Standards that were not aligned for content demonstrated either no connection or very vague connection between the high school standards content and the college expectations. For rigor, a higher rigor rating means that the college expectations require a greater cognitive demand than that in the high school standards, and a similar rigor rating meant that the college expectations required a comparable level of cognitive demand than what would be seen in the high school standards. Next slide, please. Another consideration when we're thinking about alignment is whether misalignment or lack of alignment is actually expected or not expected. Expected misalignment is something we observe through the analyses where there's a group of high school standards that just aren't going to be covered in the post-secondary content. For example, the first-year credit-bearing English course that's a general education requirement is English composition with a focus on writing. We shouldn't be surprised that literature standards aren't present because the course itself doesn't focus on literature content. Similarly, in the first-year credit-bearing courses, we would expect there to be content not included in high school standards because those courses are not intended to be a redo of high school. Instead, they're building upon what was learned in high school. So given that, let's look at our high-level takeaways from the preliminary findings for ELA and math. For ELA, for the content we would expect to be aligned, the Maryland CCR ELA standards identified for students to meet at the end of grade 10 align to the content expectations of post-secondary course content. This is true for both developmental English and first-year credit-bearing English courses. In particular, the writing and language strands of the ELA standards had the highest level of alignment, followed by reading informational text. This makes sense given what we learned about the college course content, emphasizing things like writing conventions, the writing process, and conducting academic research. The rigor of developmental courses is most often at a similar or lower expectation level than those found within the grades 9 to 10 ELA standards. This isn't surprising given the focus on the developmental courses on building or refreshing basic skills like vocabulary and conventions. Rigor within the first-year credit-bearing ELA was most often at a similar or higher level of expectation. Next slide, please. For the content we would expect to be aligned for math, the Maryland CCR math standards identified for students to meet at the end of grade 10 align to the content expectations of post-secondary course content. More detailed alignment findings will be included in the final report, along with findings from science and certificate granting training programs. But overall, the preliminary analysis of the alignment findings show that the expectations for what students should know and be able to do by the end of grade 10 are generally aligned to the post-secondary content expectations. We'll now move on to some limitations and then key takeaways. With regard to limitations, post-secondary stakeholder engagement, the course inventory and programmatic survey, which provided the bulk of the data that informed the alignment review, Those are limited to community colleges, and although this is an appropriate starting point for this research, given the focus on entry-level and developmental course expectations, future studies may consider a deeper review of course requirements and expectations at all post-secondary institutions in Maryland. In addition, the content and standards alignment analysis was intended to focus primarily on post-secondary perspectives about college and career readiness and expectations. We were able to complement post-secondary engagement with some engagement with workforce and K-12 stakeholders, but future studies may consider deeper engagement with those groups. Next slide, please. Summarizing our key takeaways from the alignment analysis. Overall, the Maryland K-12 content standards, which students should meet by the end of grade 10, align to the content expectations of post-secondary course content in ELA and math. However, post-secondary stakeholders did note that incoming students could use further development in self-direction, time management, critical thinking, and social emotional skills. There is a potential for bias in placement tests. It's consistent with existing research on bias in assessments. And top performing systems use consistent, rigorous college prep curriculum and counseling early in the students' educational journeys. They also tend to have clear vocational pathways beginning in high school or earlier to support students in their pathways. Next slide. Next slide, there we go.
Did you go back? Yes. Go back to the previous slide. Yeah. With this latter bullet, are there any states that stand out in your mind as doing the CCR especially well? You said other high-performing educations in the U.S. provide you, so they're. I'm asking, can you name some of those high-performing that we might want to look at some point to learn from what they're doing?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that, the 3 states that we looked at, which were Colorado, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, were selected based on their performance in terms of students' performance on ACT and SAT college and career readiness benchmarks, state level performance in the NAEP assessments, and also degree attainment in those states. So that's kind of an initial picture that, something is going well in those states. And then when we looked further into them, some of the examples we shared from Massachusetts and Colorado in terms of the specific career planning and counseling programs that they have available, I think those are worth further looking into. But that said, I mean, one of our suggestions in general is that the international comparisons are not quite as useful because of the many just fundamental differences between the US and these countries. And so I think in future research, looking at additional US states that are also high performing, considering how similar or different they are with Maryland in terms of population, for example, there's some opportunities to keep digging there. But the 3 that we selected were selected based on the fact that they seem to be exemplars in this area.
Do we know, I mean, the direct comparison would be the amount of remediation that students who go through their various assessments and programs, how much do they have much lower remediation rates when they go to post-secondary college, school, than Maryland does? And you probably don't have that data, as my guess.
We unfortunately don't, but I think it would be really interesting to look at that as another metric for selecting.
Is what they're doing working for our what we're headed for with the CCR standard? That would be very interesting to know. Maybe we can find.
Looking a little further into like detailed post-secondary data could help with that. We may not get exactly what you're looking at there, but yeah, that's a great point.
And the commission certainly focused on Massachusetts in making its recommendation, so they might be a good state for us to look at.
Yes, and that was one of the reasons that they were included in the analysis, in addition to their general high performance.
On the summary of key takeaways, the first bullet, you say from our engagement with post-secondary stakeholders. Who are you referring to there?
Those are our primarily our participants in the focus groups. So the majority of the focus groups were participants from post-secondary institutions, both heavily community college, but also four-year institutions?
Well, and some of the information that I've received, those post-secondary stakeholders do not believe that they were fully engaged, and they only had a cursory analysis or cursory group session that they did not believe was as adequate as it should be. So we need to go back and double check that, because there is a disconnect there to start with. So we need to check back with them to confirm again their view about this, because from the information that I've received, they do not believe that they had sort of the in-depth analysis, in-depth support, and participation in what you're reporting here. That's a different question. I just want you to know that that's out there. Secondly, if I read this correctly, in this first bullet, one could walk away from this believing that our alignment is fairly consistent with what is required and what is needed in post-secondary education. And the only thing that we need are other social and emotional factors, whatever that means, in order to ensure greater success. That's a pretty remarkable finding, in my opinion. Given what we see are the actual results on the ground.
Yeah, thank you for raising that.
Well, hold just a minute. This statement, and looking at it as it is, does it not align with the factors that are on the ground in the institution? And maybe I'm reading this wrong, so please correct me if I'm wrong here.
I think the statement is addressing the issue of content alignment. So this piece of the study is around the content alignment, and we are concluding that the content overall is aligned. That does not speak to student performance, which is a separate issue.
I understand that, and you say that student performance is disassociated with that, the alignment, based on other social and emotional factors. Whereas we have, and if it was off by a little bit, I could say yes, that could be a case. But when you have such a huge disconnect between the two, and you related that to non-academic skills such as direction, time management, critical thinking, and other social emotional factors, whatever that is, that's a huge gap between the two based on what I'm seeing here.
Can I add one thing to that? So what Lauren was trying to express is we're talking about alignment between the content expectations of high school. And the point about non-academic skills is not the full disconnect. The big piece of the puzzle there that is not on that slide is instructional quality, student supports, everything else that goes into student learning is not on that slide. And so I just want to recognize that it's not just that we're saying it's the non-academic skills. But
I'm well aware that you can include behavior health in that as well. I'm quite well of that. I serve on the board of Regents of the University of Maryland system, so I'm well aware of that. But I'm simply saying, looking at this statement, which is a pretty remarkable statement, and looking at the performance that you had, and the content is aligned, meaning that what we're providing in the schools and what the teachers are actually teaching in the classroom based on the syllabi and everything else, one could walk away from this and saying that there's nothing else that we need to do. All we need to do is ensure that these social and emotional factors are clear, and we will get much higher performance. I mean, that's the takeaway that I can walk away from that. And I
just want to, we're not speaking to what teachers are actually teaching in the classroom. We're speaking to the state level content standards.
Yeah, well, what you're saying though, based on the syllabi, what they in terms of the course content, what you believe based on that information that you receive and with your stakeholder meeting that you've had with higher education, that the alignment is fairly consistent with what will be successful in the first year or so, first 2 years in college. And you now have a pretty significant disconnect between the actual performance. And we suggest that the actual performance is due to these factors that you've outlined here.
I would just comment that maybe it would be helpful if we added in that first bullet and reiterate that post-secondary stakeholders also identified that incoming students were underprepared in English and math.
Well,
So
okay.
I think
First of all,
we've said that earlier on, but it is not in that statement on that slide, and I think that would help to clarify.
Well, first of all, we need to go back and have a greater discussion with the post-secondary stakeholders, because they would disagree, many of them would disagree with this statement. That's the first thing you need to do, because they do not feel that they have been significantly included, other than a group survey that does not include the variety of things that they would like to have had and like to be engaged in this, and they're not. So I'm just being honest with you. That's what they reported to me.
Yep, and we definitely recommend for future research that we engage with a wider range of post-secondary stakeholders and workforce stakeholders. For the purposes of this study, we
Well, I'm not sure whether or not that it could be part of the responsibility, but there needs to be a greater alignment and a greater involvement with those secondary stakeholders. They are significantly outside of this entire process. And what I'm saying to you is that they will disagree with a portion of what you stated here, and they need to be more actively involved. Whether or not that's something you can do in a further study or involvement, or whether or not that's something SDE needs to do. But right now, they don't feel that they are actively engaged and involved at a level that could justify this statement.
Well, thank you. That's helpful feedback for us.
And I do think it's very important that you add that what you just mentioned, you would add in that first bullet, because I think the chairman's point is so well taken. I mean, there's something missing other than just the social skills, as you just articulated, and that needs to be included in that first bullet.
Thank you. Yes, we can certainly make that revision.
Thank you. You can proceed. Thank you.
I think we just have one last slide, which is to talk about what's next. So the final report, which combines the findings from the content and standards alignment analysis and the predictability analysis, will be released in September. And we'll expand on the preliminary analysis that we presented today and provide a more comprehensive picture of the alignment between the K-12 content standards and the post-secondary expectations, along with an in-depth analysis resulting from the content and standards alignment review. We'll draw some connections between the alignment and the preliminary insights in this report, and we'll include updated and synthesized findings from the predictive validity analysis. Thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation today. Should we hand it back to Jordan and see if there are any further questions?
I have one quick question. Will your final report make any recommendations on what the CCR standard should be in Maryland?
It will include recommendations, including suggestions, considerations for you all for what this CCR standard, how the CCR standard could be improved.
Thank you.
From what's in the interim. Yeah.
Thank you. Very good presentation. Thank you. Rachel? Executive Director.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. So thank you, and we look forward to the final report and hearing more about that at a future meeting. So I think we can move on. If there aren't any more questions, we can move on to the next item. which is the expert review teams. And I will turn it over to Dr. Collins and Dr. Cage.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, AIB board members. Good to see everyone. I'm Dr. Collins, and I will be presenting an update on the expert review team, along with my colleague, Matt Decay, and also Dr. Cage, Paula Cage. And I just wanted to start by thanking Rachel and her staff for the ongoing dialogue about the expert review team process. It's been long but rewarding just to be able to implement and discuss and make revisions along the way. So thank you, Rachel and team. And then also thank you to the expert review team members that are part of this process thus far. You'll hear the updates on hiring and how we're hiring more, but they have truly been a fresh voice, and they are eyes and ears on the ground of how we can make this process better. And also I've, always remind folks that this is not to be an I gotcha, but a way to help us look at instructional practices across Maryland and help us to get better. So with that said, I'll go ahead and get started. Next slide. So I'm going to first start off by talking about the purpose, really briefly, the purpose of the expert review team. As a reminder, the program is for teams to look at, to do interviews, observe classes, use other data to analyze the extent to which the Blueprint has been implemented, and to collaborate with school-based faculty and staff in the local school systems to look at why students are not making progress efficiently, and also to develop recommendations and measures and strategies to address the issues that have been identified by the expert review team. If the department, that's MSDE, and the voice of the expert review teams, based on the recommendations, determines that a school's low performance on assessments is largely due to curricular problems, the school shall adopt the curriculum developed that will be recommended to them. And then also, it does not require a public school or county board to adopt the department's curriculum standards and curriculum, and may not be constructed to do so. So this is straight Blueprint language. Just wanted to remind everyone what it said. Next slide. Just wanted to give you a high-level overview of what's happened up to this point. So in 2021, 2022, we had some great pilot school reviews at the elementary and middle school level. We had utilized the draft rubric that we had submitted to the AIB to conduct those pilot reviews. That helped us not only to see how it would feel in action, but also get on-the-ground feedback from the participants and the initial reviewers that were hired. And we were made refinements to the review rubric and all the resources that were developed at that time as well. Since that time, we continued to do, we did training. Our initial training was last July and August. And we had a follow-up training in October because we also hired some new expert review team members. So we continued the training. And we were able to also continue the pilot to do some high schools as well, to make, again, changes to the rubric and the resources, and just strengthening everything to make sure it was aligned to the Blueprint. This summer, you'll see later on, I'll be a little bit more specific, but we did conduct training of the expert review team members, cohort 1, utilizing the revised resources. Also, the site visit documentation that LEA Blueprint coordinators would be able to see. We were able to share that. And our main goal is to begin the official visits this fall. However, knowing that this should be an iterative process. So as we get into doing these actual visits and we learn, we'll be making some changes to the resources and the rubric that has been designed thus far. And also the voice and input from the LEAs and the visits will be extremely important to making the resources that we use to collect feedback be better. So that will be ongoing throughout this process. Next slide. I'm going to have Matt Decay provide an update on the methodology that will be used, that was used to identify the official school reviews for this school year. Matt?
Thank you. Next slide. So in selecting the schools for the upcoming school year for visits, we used 6 criteria. I'll go through them, but note that 5 of them are called out in the blueprint or identifying schools. So the first are the lowest performing schools. And the way we operationalized that was in terms of their percentage of proficient students in ELA and math. If you want to get into the details, they're in the footnotes. We're using weighted averages of both tests for each school. So we're not really favoring ELA over math or vice versa. The second criterion was lower performing, which is called out in the blueprint. So the way we define that was the schools that are not the lowest performing, but they're identified as lowest performing, or they could be the lowest growth from the 2021 year to 2022. The third criterion are highest performing schools. So we also use the same measure of ELA and math proficiency rates, but instead we look at the ones with the highest percentages in these areas. The fourth is learning loss. So we're looking at pre-pandemic to up to 2022. So over this period, what was their change in percent proficient, again, in ELA math combined? And the ones with the largest decreases are selected for visits. The fifth criterion was learning gaps, and this is something that we use to look at some of the pilot schools. So we're looking at differences in their percent proficient on the 2022 MCAP, ELA, and math tests for individual student groups. Those groups included the 7 race ethnicity categories, whether students with disabilities, English learners, or economically disadvantaged. And we compared their proficiency rate within that school with their peers, meaning all other students. And then regardless of group, which ones had the largest gaps within a school. The 6th category is the largest one out of all the schools selected. And this one is, the blueprint says all schools need to be visited by a certain date. So aside from the first criteria, if they're not meeting those first 5 criteria, the remaining schools are selected at random so that it draws from, and we did look into see, does this ensure geographic diversity? See a hand raised?
Yep. Hi, thank you. I had, I guess, sort of a request for you to think about with regards to this. As we go forward across years, it would be wonderful if we had a metric that we could use that was consistent reporting from results from the expert review teams. And this 6th category would really allow us to do this. This would be a random selection, which hopefully doesn't necessarily exclude some of the groups from 1 through 5. So like if 6 could truly somehow be a random group, but stratified across important like levels of school, geographic region of school, and so that we could use that as a metric across years to see how things may be changing. And I'm saying this as part of the outcomes measures work group from the blueprint. I think that would be really helpful. So just encourage you to think about that.
Yeah, and I think that's some of the thinking we had in mind in terms of how to select the other group, which I mentioned is the bulk of the schools. And I said we did it completely at random, but we did check to see if it turned out to be at random, that there weren't regional or just a grade span clumpings of schools. If there are, we can fix that, but it turned out that the randomization was pretty good.
Just for future years, I would encourage, if you stratify ahead of time, you don't have to hope that it turns out to be good.
I think that's all for methodology. If there are
Member Doss has a question.
I have a question, and this may not be in your area, but recruitment efforts for the expert team members. review members. How's that coming along? Do we have sufficient number of members to cover schools?
I
That's
think
a
that's a great
great
segue.
segue. Perfect. Yes, yes, thanks. Great question. So I'm actually going to talk about the expert review team hiring and training process thus far. You'll get to see where we are. So we're calling, just, cohort 1 is where we started last year with our training. So we still have cohort 1, and we're in the process of hiring more reviewers. So 130 expert review team members from our 140 member cohort are returning. We sent out a survey to everyone last year just to see if they were interested in maintaining, and the majority did. And we also reopened the application window up this April, and so have been doing rolling interviews ever since. To visit 200 schools, 200 plus schools this year, we will need to hire approximately 170 new expert review team members for a total of 300 active ERT members on the team. And we also want to make sure that we have a bank, right? In case situations change, we can always pull from the bank. So everyone still will be trained. That way, in the event that there's someone who gets sick, needs to be on leave, is on a team, can't participate, we can pull from the bank as well. So participants apply through a robust process that our human resource department developed, a really rigorous application process. There's a panel interview, a performance task, references are checked, and then they're hired. So right now, we have applicants that are going through the vetting process through our HR process right now.
What, if I may, what are the qualifications for being?
Great segue. Great segue. And so these are the qualifications. For teachers, we have, sorry about that. My son just walked in, my apologies. For teachers, a minimum of 3 years of effective teaching experience, and they have to demonstrate evidence of improving student outcomes. They provide, so when they apply, they submit specific evidence that shows they've improved outcomes. It's part of the application. For school leaders and central office staff, they have to have a minimum of 3 years of school and/or central office leadership experience and demonstrate evidence of improving student outcomes as well. And then for other experts, they must have a bachelor's degree and authored peer-reviewed research, papers, articles on effective practices, have experience leading school quality reviews, and have experience serving as a superintendent, chief executive officer, or other executive leadership position. And what we've done to make sure we're monitoring sort of that we have a range of experiences, our HR department helps us to look at the scope of reviewers so that we have a balanced sector of reviewers, not solely teachers or school administrators, et cetera, et cetera. So we do monitor that as well.
Real quick question on the,
Mhm.
3 years of effective teaching seems pretty modest to me to be an expert. I would think of expert as being a national board certified teacher, say, for example, perhaps. So how will these, if there are a lot of such people, will they be viewed in their schools, the schools they visit, as true experts?
We believe that they will be viewed as true experts. Some of the candidates might that even like for the teacher level as well have be NBC certified. That is a factor in the actual application process. It drills down where the applicants identify their prior experience. I don't know offhand how many of our expert reviewers might be NBC certified, but they might, but that is not the only factor.
No, I understand. So one thing it would be interesting to know, once you've selected the teams, how many of them are, what is their level of teaching experience?
Sure, that's easy to capture.
Yeah, I mean, if they're disproportionately at the 3 years, I would be a bit concerned. But if most of them have considerably more experience, that's a different matter.
Sure.
Member Lynch has a question and then member Mako.
Thank you. Yeah, I share Vice Chair Kerwin's just thoughts around a minimum of 3 years of teaching is really a teacher's first year of tenure, and so that's a pretty sort of early level of expertise level. But I think what I am wondering is in one of your earlier slides, you had talked about evaluating curriculum and making curriculum recommendations. And so I guess my sort of two-part question is, how will these teams be evaluating curriculum, and what are you looking at in terms of qualifications beyond teaching experience to determine curricular writing and evaluation experience?
So this is where the training on the actual resources, but the specific rubric, the criteria that they're going to be looking for in the schools is really important. And the training that they get in, that they take in the summer, they actually have a chance to practice observing classrooms, being in focus groups to calibrate what quality curriculum would look like in a classroom. So that's why the rubric is a 4-scale rubric that is really specific to that. In terms of the specific questions that are asked about their background, I don't have that in front of me, but there are questions for sure where it drills down to what experiences some of the reviewers, whether they're teachers or central office or other experts, might have, and not just being a curriculum writer, but also a curriculum reviewer. I know that's part of the questions that are asked. And then through the actual interview process that they go through, some of the interview questions, that's another level where we get to see what their background is to make sure there's a range of questions. But I think in terms of their expertise in looking at curriculum, the rubric that's been designed gets into the nuts and bolts of what high quality instruction materials looks like, based on national standards and what we found from other states, and then calibrating and training the reviewers on what those look-fors need to be. Helps. We also ask for some preliminary information from the schools before and after around curriculum as well. And so that also provides a level of opportunity for the reviewers to take stock on what the schools have done or the LEAs have done in terms of curriculum. So it's really embedded into the rubric as well.
Can you talk a little bit about what that might look like? Because I think we, for those of us who have been in schools, we understand that there is a huge gap sometimes between what a written curriculum is and what a taught curriculum is. And we have high quality teachers that use no curriculum or take great liberties with an existing written curriculum in order to get the work done. And, sort of conversely, we have teachers who may either not fully understand the curriculum or may not implement the curriculum as intended. So I think one of the things that I'm looking for is, if we're going to be making curricular recommendation changes, is that we are looking beyond just the taught curriculum to determine if it's really a professional development issue or if it is a curriculum issue, because curriculum changes in school systems are costly and create a lot of upheaval. And so I think that part of what we have to be able to do is to be very laser focused in determining if this is a professional development versus whether this is really a curriculum development issue. And so I'm wondering how your team is conceptualizing how you will be making that differentiation.
Sure. So twofold. One is through the taught curriculum, seeing what's actually happening is through when the reviewers go out and do the observations and the information that they're collecting. Beyond that, the schools will be submitting central office folks information about what curriculum they've selected in ELA and mathematics and any other curriculum that they've selected. Some of the other information that we actually already have on hand, because we've been also on MSDE's curriculum side looking at high quality instruction materials. So we do have an idea across all of our 24 LEAs, what are they have they designed their own curriculum, or they're using something, for example, that's been greenlit on Ed Reports, which tends to be the floor in terms of high quality curriculum. But a lot of between the preliminary information that the LEAs and the schools will be submitting, that will let us know which curriculums they're using for ELA and mathematics. Could be science and social studies as well. So that's the curriculum they've purchased. It'll tell us there are questions we have, and this aligns to some of the blueprint implementation plan questions as well. What is your process for getting approval of your curriculum? How long has the curriculum been implemented? There are, through the focus group, questions with the teachers and the administrators. We ask questions such as, what does the professional learning look like for teaching your curriculum? How often does it occur? Who's trained? Those kinds of questions as well. And then in some of the post-visit questions that we'll need to ask to follow up, we can get at those questions as well. So it's twofold. It's asking specific questions to the focus groups and those at the district and the school level, but then also through the observations, seeing the information and then triangulating all of that information to paint a picture of what's occurring.
All right. Any other questions? If not, let's move on.
Oh, yeah, I had one more question. I apologize if I missed this, but on earlier on in slide 4, when I was looking at kind of the span of the years, there were 3 pilot visits that were conducted in 21-22. How many were conducted in 22-23?
There were 2. Those were in December at high schools, because in the when we were going to do the additional, we were going to do 5 pilots in that first year, but COVID messed with us. And so we couldn't get to do the last 2. It was towards the end of the year. And so we were able to do them in the fall. We wanted to prioritize high school so that we would have pilots at the elementary, middle, and high schools.
And then what is the plan for 23-24?
That's coming up. We're actually planning to start the official reviews in October. So
And
that's in the next set of slides we're going to go through.
What's the projected number?
200 plus schools.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even looking at like what you've listed here and the, it seems like we're already out of compliance, right? The 10% we're supposed to have been done by July 1st, 2023, and it seems like we've done now 5. I guess the 200 is a means to try to catch up, but
Yes, we do need to catch up.
okay. All right, thanks.
Mhm. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the summer training that's taken place thus far, just so you know, we did 3 trainings this summer with expert review team members in various parts of Maryland, like we did last summer. And that was having them in different locations was helpful to make sure the reviewers could participate. Next slide, please. Okay.
Excuse me.
So just in terms,
I'm sorry. It looked like 124 people were trained. Is that right?
let's see here. Yes, 24 people were trained. And then what we do is we continue to do the training once we hire reviewers. So the training will never really stop. We'll have to continue training not only for calibration purposes, but anytime we open up the reviewer, hire reviewers, we'll have to continue to do the training, and we'll continue to do it.
So we're looking for 200 this year. No, that's schools.
200 schools.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, we need to hire. We're in the process of hiring right now. We need. I think I said. Go back to those slides. Go back to the slide, Phil. Yes. Here. Okay. So we need to hire approximately 170 expert review team members.
And they'll, as you hire them, they'll go through the same training program?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in terms of what they do, it's a 2-day training. They get an introduction to the expert review team resources. They have a chance to practice actually conducting classroom reviews. We do simulations with them. They practice facilitating focus groups. They pretend that they're a parent, or they pretend that they're a teacher or a student group, and they practice facilitating focus groups. They practice going through the review protocols. They spend a lot of time. The majority of the 2 days is around consensus building and calibration and the debriefing amongst each others. It's actually pretty intriguing to watch coming to consensus, because they really get super duper engaged, and they have dialogue. So they spend a lot of time doing that together. And then they also practice and talk about report writing as well. Next slide.
Can I just ask a quick question about that?
Sure.
As they're doing calibration and consensus building, I'm assuming that there's a process by which we are building that sort of calibration and consensus against a standard, you know, because we could all sort of come and do some consensus building, but it may not be the correct consensus if we don't have a set of standards.
Absolutely. That's why the rubric is critically important, because that's the bar. And so as they are actually practicing this process, that we have to train them simultaneously on the rubric, because that's what the bar is. You're absolutely correct. That is the standard.
And then can I ask what the ongoing training is beyond the summer training?
Beyond the summer training, our emphasis will be, it has to be the calibration and consensus building. And that's why we need to look at these in cohorts, so that we make sure that as they continue to go out and do reviews and they provide us feedback. I'll give you an example. Earlier on, one of the areas that caused a lot of discussion that we had to work with the reviewers on and embed more training around was differentiation and what that looks like and what it means. And so that's why we feel like, based on our experiences with the reviewers and the discussions, that calibration piece will have to be ongoing with the reviewers, whether they're newly hired or just hired. One of the things that we also have been able to do and include, and will continue to do this, is virtual training sessions with the reviewers throughout the year, where we don't always have to bring them in person, but through the reviews, if we're seeing that they had a little bit of struggle or lots of discussion in one particular area of the rubric, or took them a long time to calibrate on a particular area, we'll continue to provide them training on that particular area throughout. And almost monthly, if necessary. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Just wanted to give you a high-level overview of the feedback we've gotten from the training. The members valued the importance of collaborating, as a team in the reviews and the focus groups. They felt it was necessary to be specific and rely on observed evidence to determine whether the practices were evident or not. The focus is to collect and provide objective evidence to improve outcomes for students, and the collaboration is key to gathering themes from the focus groups and evidence from classroom reviews to form consensus. The expert review team members were pleased with the preparation and execution of the training. They felt they were insightful and were able to provide feedback to that improved their practices. They felt, as a direct result of the training, they were prepared to conduct the site visits and give us actionable feedback. And a suggestion that they had would be helpful to have a one-stop shop that contained all the most valuable links and resources and documents to complete the reports and with the resources. And so we're glad that they brought that up, because that is something we had already started working on. So we will do that to make sure that's happening. We want to get into what the process will look like for the site reviews and the report writing. So I'm going to turn it to Dr. Cage to talk about that.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to start with the timeline and deployment for official school reviews. So in order to make sure that we are getting to those 200 plus schools, we are going to start with doing in October and November. We'll talk about why we're starting in October, doing 3 school reviews every week. In December and February, we will up to 6 school reviews a week. And then March through May, we will go through 9 school reviews a week. And again, this is to be able to get us to those 200 plus schools for this upcoming school year.
Dr. Cage,
Yes.
it just seems like with the cadence of the year, like I'm thinking about what March and May looks like in a school with testing, and really what December and February looks like with weather. Like really October and November is the, in a lot of ways, the optimal time in order to go through at least do, an equitable number of reviews, but to do kind of the slow roll during the kind of optimal time and then leave yourself for, doing the maximum amount of reviews during the time period of the year that I think is most challenged for schools to accommodate. Seems like it would be, it seems like the plan is going to run into some hiccups as you get to the later parts of the year.
Yes, most definitely. This also helps with the process of hiring those extra expert review team members. So they're still going through that process. Once they go through that process of vetting, then they have to actually be trained. And we're projecting that they will do that training in October. So those new review team members won't be coming on until that October, November timeframe so that they can fully be trained. And that's why we're able to push more of those reviews a little later. Was there another question?
Can I ask just a technical question? So right now we're doing 3 school reviews every week. So that's 12 in a month. We currently have how many existing reviewers?
We have 130 that are coming back. 124 have been trained right now.
So you have ready and at your disposal about 250?
No, 124 expert review team members
Okay.
that have been trained.
That have been, okay, so wait a minute. So you have 130 that, I'm sorry. So you have 130 that are returning, and then you have 124 that were newly trained, or that are just, so do you have is it 2 separate cohorts of people?
Yeah, so we have 130 members that are coming back.
Okay.
Only 124 of those were able to be trained during the summer because they had conflicts or some things happen. So they will be trained in October with the new expert review team members when they come on.
Okay. So they can't utilize the training that they had from last year?
So no, because last year was that year of, we were kind of simulating different things. This year, we were actually able to use those draft documents so they can actually see what it looks like to be able to write a report, what it looks like to be able to look at the rubric. So they actually saw the documents this year.
Okay.
The other part that I wanted to mention is our hope is that this will speed up once we get folks trained. We just need to get started, right? And depending on how much time and it takes to get folks trained and feel comfortable, our hope, I think we all have the same goal, right? Is to do many more than we can. But as Dr. Cage says, many of the resources and things have been improved since last summer. So it was like retraining on the new review resources and things of that nature. But our hope is to speed this up wherever possible, especially as we get started. We will be looking at this process and evaluating it regularly. And any efforts to get better and speed it up, but also be true to the process is going to be really important. And also understanding that schools and LEAs are in different places. And so helping them to see what the bar is, but every school and LEA is in different places. But we will be evaluating this on a regular basis, and any means that we can use to speed up, look at other training methods, not just throwing people into the fire, right? But making sure they have the skill sets to do this is going to be really, really important. Next slide. Oh, Mr. Mencken.
Yeah,
had a question.
you know, I don't want to belabor the point, but it, you know, I guess from our perspective, I can speak just from my perspective. It does seem like, yeah, in a lot of ways, it seems like we're starting at ground zero when we've had 2 years of time to pilot things and hire up and figure things out. And yet, you know, it seems like we are going to start the year with a group of reviewers that aren't trained, you know, like, it aren't trained on the tools that I think the pilot years were designed to calibrate and verify and get people, you know, get people unified on so that we could hit the ground running. You know, and I think it seems like we're already playing catch up, but we're not even at a place where we can, you know, start the year with, you know, a kind of a full, you know, a full team in order to roll things out, you know, in a judicious manner.
Well, your observation, I think, Member Menko is correct. And I raised this, as you may recall, many months ago. I'm disappointed with the pace where we're at this point in time. And just a couple of observations. There is value in starting, even when you're not perfectly started. We have sometimes the need to be perfect before we ever get started. And we fail to miss, or we miss opportunities that we may have and other things that could develop as we move forward. One of the side effects, and what turns out to be one of the major effects of this, is the fact that you have expert review teams that are actually on the ground starting to work. That you will have, in my opinion, if it's done right and properly publicized, you would have some level of self-correction and some level of seriousness in other locations because the mere fact that you've started a review process. The IRS does not get to every taxpayer. They don't do everything perfectly. But the fact that they are out making inspections and doing audits and reviews provides a level of responsiveness on the part of those of us who pay our taxes, that we're going to go back and see what they are looking at, why they're doing it, and make adjustments all along. If you didn't have that and you're waiting until everything is perfect, then you never have that. So the mere fact that we have an RS and the number of audits that they do correspond to the efficiency and the effectiveness of how well people respond on taxes. The amount of audits, the amount of inspections that we do and reviews will have a cascading effect if we ever get started. But we're waiting to get in the boat. We want everything to be perfect before we ever get started in the boat. I raised this many months ago. I said we did not have enough. The second thing that I think that I'm looking at, and maybe I'm wrong about this, we are treating so much in this review process as though they are the same. I'm hearing what we're doing in terms of calibration and some of the other things that we're doing, working with parents, all of those things are fine. But let's take a step back and look at where we are. We're starting late. We have a huge problem, both within our schools and in the communities around the entire state, on math and reading. And if we're going to have the expert review team that will go out and treat everything basically the same and not have a great emphasis in our review as it relates to those things, then we've developed a process that looks good on paper, but does not get to the real fundamental challenge that we have. And so I look at the many years that I've been in law school, we have accreditation challenges, and review teams come out and audit and report. They're not going to treat everything in our law school the same way. If you have a problem associated with your bar performance they're going to zero in on that like a laser. And they will spend less time with some of the other things. If you have ethical concerns within your law school, your faculty, student, they're going to zero in on that like a laser. If you're not hiring the appropriate people, and that becomes a concern, if you're not doing appropriate publication, they zero in on that like a laser. They don't come in and basically treat everything as though it's the same. Our problem, to start with, among many others, but to start with, is that we have a challenge in our literacy and in our math. And we need to make sure that as we review this, that becomes a central focus of what we are looking at. Not that we don't look at other things, but our accreditation and looking at other places, they zero in on the most important things, the most fundamental things you need to get to as quickly as you need to get to. And there's not as greater emphasis on some of the other things. And so what I'm hearing here, correct me if I'm wrong, we're treating too much as though it's the same. I want to make sure that we are focusing with a bulk of our time to review on those things for which we have the greatest concern or problems with. And that's what our focus needs to be. I'm not sure we spend enough time in the review on literacy and on math. I'm not sure that we do that. So the challenge for me is not how we deploy. It's not the training of the people that we have. All those things are fine. I give you credit for that. It's wonderful matrix of what you're doing. But it's the amount and the frequency of the reviews and what we're actually reviewing consistent with or correlated to the problems that we have in terms of our focus. That to me is the central challenge here. And maybe I've overstated this, but that's what I see as a potential challenge here. We could go through this, it could be perfect on paper, go through all of this we've just talked about. But unless we are focused on our real concerns in our review, then we may miss the problem here.
Thank you, Mr. Leggett. To your point, I do believe we have an opportunity to narrow like you're recommending. One of the areas that we've worked on over the past few months is in the original iteration of the rubric, there was a central focus, and there still is, on literacy, in particular science of reading. The initial iteration only looked at it at the elementary level. It was upgraded to focus on elementary and secondary, very specifically related to research and science of reading. And then most recently, we've added work with our math content folks and looked at research to add a math component. So that based on research, what are the aspects of mathematics that we should be seeing? And this has been a discussion we've been having at the department, is how do we narrow the focus, maybe for just this first year, on literacy and mathematics? Not that the other areas are not important, because we know the culture of a building is important. We know that, as we talked about, social emotional learning is important. There are other aspects of the rubric that have been built out that are also important. But we have spent a concerted amount of time and energy, to your point, in making sure that especially the literacy and mathematic components of the rubric are very robust and aligned to the latest research around what we should be seeing in terms of those two areas. So your point is well taken.
I'm up with this, but if you can, I'd like to follow up with you later on, just to have a secondary review of that, just to see what you're talking about in detail. So you've got my question, and I appreciate your answer. So I hope we can have a further discussion about those two factors and how we are concentrating at least a good portion of time on those real trouble areas I just described. Thank you.
Can I ask just a curiosity question? Are you, as you're updating those rubrics, are you evaluating whether the science of reading and the scientific, sort of elements of math are being implemented across disciplines, or only in those ELA and math courses?
Think about the rubric. It's across. I don't want to misspeak. I'd have to go back and look at the rubric. Because the way that the visits are set up and the school schedule is set up is for us to get into visit classrooms during either at the secondary level, the English or mathematics courses, and at the elementary level, like looking at their literacy block. I also want to say though, and Dr. Cage, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe some of the focus group questions get at the content areas across content areas. I'd have to pull up the rubric and actually look at it. To be honest with you.
So the expert review teams are not evaluating classes outside of ELA and math? Like, are they doing other tested areas like science or, like the sort of social studies component for graduation requirements? I'm wondering if there's any opportunity to look at any of the other courses that are in the tested content.
Yes. So Dr. Cage, you want to speak to the, without getting in the weeds, the other components of the rubric?
Yeah, so we do look at different classes. So it's not just ELA and math. We go to some of the specialty classes. We go to some of the interventions. So we're looking at a range of classes throughout that 2-day visit.
There's also with another section of the rubric looks at college and career readiness. Another section of the rubric looks at planning time, so how teams are coming together to plan for instruction. Another portion of the rubric looks at how teams are coming together to use data to plan for instruction, as well as the time, how the school or the system utilizes talent, time, and resources to plan. Dr. Cage, what are some of the other domains that cut across the content areas?
Yes, we also look at educator support, observation and feedback. We talked about literacy, post-CCR pathways. So the rubric goes into all of those different areas in alignment with Blueprint.
Well, let me ask a question and follow up, if you don't mind, Member Lynch. Because a moment ago I heard where we were, in fact, looking at the rubric to pay a great deal of focus on reading, literacy, and math. Now I hear a response that covers in a 2-day period a wide latitude of a whole bunch of things. That are we talking the same thing here? Because I'm getting sound like two different answers here.
Yes, no, you're correct. We're talking about the same thing. Dr. Cage, why don't you speak to, because we don't have it in this presentation, we did it in the spring presentation. Why don't you talk to the specific categories, the sections of the rubric specifically? Well, we are talking about the same thing. And Dr. Rachel, I don't know if you want to explain the rubric as well that we submitted. I don't know if you want to give any insight to the board members.
I was just going to suggest that you could go through the next slides around the number of classes that are going to be visited and talk about which classes. Maybe that would help.
Okay. Next slide, please. I think it's maybe 2 slides. Okay, so this is a draft review of a day 1 schedule. So at the beginning of the day, the expert review team, so 6 members go out to a school. The expert review team will meet with the principal at the beginning of the day. This is to go over any logistics that have maybe changed, to tell us where the focus groups will be held, to walk us through the actual school. So that will start at the beginning of the day. Then the 6 members split up into 2 groups of 3. 3 members go and they do classroom reviews, and the other 3 members will do focus groups all day. Those focus groups will consist of students, parents, teachers, and school leadership. Not to mistaken the principal, because the principal has a separate interview that is done with the actual principal. Throughout that schedule, what happens is we build in time for the 3 members to go in and do the classroom review, but then have time to actually debrief afterwards to be able to gain that, to calibrate and gain consensus. So there's always that built-in time. So for instance, 45 minutes to look at a classroom, and then 15 minutes to actually debrief and gain some consensus. These look-fors are actually in the classroom capture sheet, and this is what each expert review team member is using throughout that classroom review. That is approximately, depending on if it's an elementary, middle, or high school, 6 to 8 classrooms each day. And so while the classroom reviews are going on, the other 3 members are doing the focus groups. Again, having somewhere between about 45 minutes to do those focus groups and then 15 minutes to debrief.
So am I looking at this right? I would get 45 minutes in math and 45 minutes in literacy?
Yes.
Do-day review?
Yes, depending on the actual school
Well,
schedule.
that's my problem. We're treating this like they're all the same. Our challenge and our focus. Let me just make it clear to you. The parents that you are talking to, the officials, the administrators, and others are concerned about all of these things, but they're really concerned about our math and our reading performance. And we could have the best feedback, we could have the best debriefing, we could have the best parents in the world. They will turn on you like on us and all of us on a dime if our scores do not improve. And we're treating this as though all of these things are the same. I don't get this. We have a real challenge here. One of the things that we need to do, I think we need to go back and look at this carefully so that we are aligned with the challenge that we face as a system. Not that we don't do some of these other things, and maybe all of them, but not with the same level of intensity across the board. This is not going to address our biggest concern, our biggest challenge. Because if we say to people, we've been in your school and we've debriefed our teachers, we've had a wonderful conversation with our parents and everything else, but your math scores didn't move. That's our focus. Our reading scores didn't move. That's our focus. And that's what I've been trying to get us to look at for the last couple of months. We have a wonderful process here, but this process should not treat everything as though they're the same at this point in time. We do not have that time. And so I think you need to look at this, and it may not be a major change you need to make, but I think that we need to laser focus, not that we forget everything else, but we need to elevate those 2 areas to a high degree possible to make sure that what we're doing in our classroom, what is our syllabi, and what all the things that we are doing, what we're doing in actual teaching is lined and focused on getting to the bottom of that challenge. And that should be a major focus, not an equal focus.
If I can just add, if I can add to that, I agree with the chair. I will also add that I think what good schools do is integrate really high quality reading and math instruction into all classes. And so I think that that is something that you see in schools that are doing it particularly well, is that all of their instructors understand the science of reading and are integrating it in part of all of those classes. So I agree that there needs to be some level of focus. I also agree, though, that evaluating other classes to see whether or not that is transferring, so that we in essence aren't teaching something that's then being confused in some other course, is also important. Is this repeated on day 2?
So day 2, yes. So I think so day 2 is the same thing for the beginning part of the day. Again, different classes that we're looking at depending on the school and the population and the need of that school. The second half of that day, the expert review team, they come together to be able to, so the 3 members from each, they come together to be the 6, to be able to calibrate, build that consensus, and then they actually start writing the report at this point in time. before they actually leave, because we want to make sure that we're not leaving a school without giving some type of feedback. They actually meet with the leadership to give some type of feedback of what they saw within those 2 days.
I just want to say that I think that providing that really immediate feedback is very helpful, even if it's informal, so that you know, when we talk about timeliness and the urgency that I think that we hear from the chair, and I know that all of us are expressing, waiting months to be able to make any adjustments, you know, just isn't the most efficient always. So I really do appreciate that integrated into this 2 days. Is this model the same regardless of the size of school and the level of school?
Repeat the question.
Is this 2 day, is this time that we're spending, is this consistent with like a 300 seat elementary school as it is with a 2,500 seat high school? Or is every school, regardless of size or level, receiving this same 2 day walkthrough?
Good question.
Currently, they are. We started the pilot doing the 1 day, and we were able to get through some of the schools, and then we went to the 2 day. So it does depend on the size of the school, the population of the school, and what all we want to be able to see within that time frame.
Thank you.
If I could just offer, I do think based, you know, again, going back to the chair's point, especially with some of these larger schools, with multiple levels and multiple opportunities, just to be able to have more experiences. You know, a small elementary school, you can probably get into most classrooms with this model and have a really good sense. But with larger schools, you would be hard pressed to even get through a quarter of maybe the ELA offerings, much less, you know, some of those other offerings as well.
I want to pick up on the chairman's question just a moment. So if a elementary school is being reviewed, how many math classrooms would the reviewers see? Now, there'd be first grade math, second grade, third, up to fifth grade. So how many math classrooms would they actually go into?
So it does determine on, when looking at the schedule, it does determine on the Bell schedule or the schedule for that school. We want to be able to see different types of classrooms within those math, ELA, and other classrooms. So it could be different amounts on different days. It really just depends on how many classrooms we have at that school and that Bell schedule.
Yeah, but I mean, would they see every level of math that's being taught? Would they go to all 5 grades? Would they go to 1 grade?
They're going to go to at least 3 of those grades. It may not be all 5 grades, depending on the school.
But they would go to 3 math, and they would go to 3 grades, and would they see math at all 3 grades?
Yes, we're trying to see it at all different levels to be able to see what is going on in those classrooms.
Okay.
And then relatedly, can I ask, if every class has 4 or 5 class per grade, who is determining and how is it being determined which teacher you would see? And I think, you know, to the vice chair's point, if you're only seeing 3 classrooms, 1 kindergarten, 1 second grade, 1 fifth grade, are the determinations being made on the quality of 1 teacher, or is there any sort of like looking across multiple classrooms to see what's happening in each of the classes in that grade level?
Yeah, so we do look across multiple classrooms. So what we do is in the beginning of, before we go to a school, there's like this 5 weeks that we give a school, at least 5 weeks, to be able to give us all of their documentation.
Excuse me, 1 second, Dr. Cage. Phil, it might be helpful, I think, if you go to the next slide, because that visually, there's a slide we have that lays out, I thought, try the next one, the before, during, and after.
I think it was a couple back. Yes.
Yeah, this one.
Yes. So we give that 5 weeks to be able to get that documentation together. This is one of the things that the LEA and the schools talked about, how this took a lot to be able to get this documentation together. So we give 5 weeks to be able to get that documentation, review, analyze, and then synthesize that documentation, and then have time to be able to meet with the expert review team to go over that documentation in what we call the school snapshot. So they are prepared to actually go out to the school. And in that, we're asking the same thing kind of with our focus groups, but we're asking for a novice teacher, right? So at least one classroom for a novice teacher, at least one classroom for a teacher that has 4 years plus experience, at least 2 ELA classes, at least 2 math classes, advanced classes. So we're asking for all of these classes for the leader to be able to give us, and then we make the schedule based off of the information, comparing it to the Bell schedule to be able to implement that as well. The same thing with the focus groups. They have to give us all of that information, and then we actually make that schedule based off of the information that is given.
Can I? Oops, sorry, I think somebody else had their hand raised, but I do have a question.
Member Robinson has had his hand up for a little while, but we still can't hear you. Sorry. Put it in the chat.
So as you're making the determination, one of the criteria that we look at to choose a school are those outcomes for students. So disaggregated data and things like that. Are you using any classroom level data to determine which teachers you will be looking at based on any sort of classroom or grades or anything to determine what you want to take a look at while you're in the school? Or is it all principal led as to which teachers and which grades you'll be visiting?
Yeah, so we do, and this piece is where we do have the schools give us all different types of data. So you have their scope and sequence. We have received intervention data, teacher credentialing, any type of survey data, agendas for their professional learning, presentations, how they track and monitor interventions. So we look at all of that data. And then we take that to be able to compare the classrooms that we want to be able to see the actual Bell schedule to be able to make that schedule for the review.
And the Bell schedule, your daily schedule is always adjusted based on sort of what that data shows you so that you can maximize your time in the classrooms?
Yes, definitely.
So the example you gave us is just like this is in general how many people we see, but if as an example, a school does all reading instruction first thing in the morning, you wouldn't have those focus groups in the morning. You would have both teams in the classrooms. Like, is it adjusted that way?
Most definitely, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The board member Robinson question up yet in the chat?
I don't see it. I was just looking.
All right, let's go on. We'll come back to him if it one. Okay.
Okay.
Dr. Collins?
Okay, Phil, I'm not sure where we are. We did this one, we did the day 2. Talked about focus groups. Is this the last slide? Oh, Dr. Cage, why don't you talk about the report writing as well?
Yes. So with that piece, we talked about the expert review team being the eyes and the ears when they actually go out to these reviews. So, and we mentioned that over and over and over when we're doing training. Tell us what you see and what you heard. And that is the information that we want to be able to relay in the report. So we go into, that's about 2 weeks to be able to write that report. about 2 weeks for us to be able to review the report. And then we give 2 weeks for the school to be able to look at the draft of the report, make any comments and give us any feedback based off of what we have written. And then once we receive the actual report back, then we will have a week to be able to send that back to them, the finalized report. That will be sent to the school, the LEA, and AIB. So we're right now we're talking about approximately 7 weeks to assemble and publish the reports.
Okay.
And just to close, one of the things that as we've been talking about this process is trying to balance. We already know that our teachers and the principals, they do a formal evaluation observation process on a regular basis. That's baked into the school. And we know that this process, we're not going to be able to see in an ideal world every single thing, right? So to your point, Mr. Leggett, making sure we're narrowed and we're focused. We've been really trying to make sure we do that and provide as much actionable information to the district and the schools as possible to help them get better, knowing that the context of our LEAs is very different, but really to provide them with information that's actionable and useful. And understanding the current school context of, what's currently happening during the school year, especially with schedules, with staffing and teachers. There's a lot of different variables. So we're just want to make sure that I reiterate that point, that we're constantly trying to think of what's happening at the school level. We've been in LEAs and trying to keep them in mind as well. In terms of helping with next steps and making sure that we're communicating information, we have scheduled some voluntary sessions with Blueprint coordinators and central office staff to review and discuss the expert review team process and documentation. We did that with principals before we went into their buildings, and they were extremely grateful of that time. So we'll be doing that. Again, as we've mentioned, we're going to keep doing the interviews. We're going to actually get into doing the visits and begin them in October. And this will be an iterative process. We'll consider all the feedback that was provided today, and we'll continue to move forward and make adjustments along the way.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Collins. I would reemphasize again, we don't want to hold up. We can adjust as we move forward, but we've lost a lot of time already, and we can't make this perfect. And if you're willing to adjust as we move forward, then we can continue to improve on this process as we continue to get out in the field.
I think Member Robinson is going to attempt to ask his question.
Okay, hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, finally. One of the things I wanted to ask about was the actionability of the information that the schools get. You kind of just use that word actionable, which is great. When you were talking about the school selection kind of towards the beginning, and there are the 6 different categories of schools, one of the roles said high performing schools, which is great. I think that information can help us as a state, or the LEAs can help them know what's going well in certain schools. I guess my question is about it's kind of related to the last presentation from the college and career readiness. When we look at standardized test scores, sometimes there are biases that are involved in the testing. And so even in my school district, when we look at data across different schools, a lot of time the highest performing schools are the ones that have a choice aspect to them. There might be a magnet program or something like that. What I'm interested in as a practitioner might be more knowing which schools that are similar in demographic to my school are doing great things in reducing gaps and improving student performance. So I guess my question is, when you're selecting schools and when you're reporting back on the information, how do we get actionable data from schools of who serve similar populations to make sure that the data is actually actionable? How do we know this is a school that's got the same type of demographic, same maybe location geographically, and they were able to do something that this other school down the street is not able to do? How would that information be reported? Because it's great to have information just for that particular school, but just as we think about like, the broader context, how are we making sure that schools are learning from each other? Because I assume that's the reason why we had the higher performing school as being one of the schools that you wanted to visit.
I'll share one piece and Matt can jump in, but I know in the statute, high performing schools is one of the criteria that's mandated. That is part of it. Matt, do you want to take try and answer Mr. Robinson's question?
Sure. I mean,
Well,
we certainly have that data.
I was more so saying, like, how I get that it's mandated. Are there ways that we can also communicate information about schools that are doing great things in terms of improving that are similar in demographic? Like, I kind of want to, I guess, kind of broaden just from giving actionable feedback to a specific school after the visit to thinking systemically, like, how are we making sure that every school is learning from schools? And I'll just say from my school, it's a comprehensive program. A lot of times the information and the feedback that I want isn't necessarily going to be from the magnet program down the street. I want to know, like, a school that's similar to mine, what are they doing that's moving, students' literacy scores and their math scores? That's the information that I kind of would want to know.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of good sense. I think one of the things that we can consider, it's probably on our radar, is because we've all talked about it, sort of like a year in review, like, okay, we spent this year visiting all of these schools. When we compile all of the data, what does it show, right? Because this is supposed to help us get better across the state of Maryland. So to your point, that is something that we could probably easily compile into one report. And I would imagine, since we have to provide information to the AIB annually and present on ERT, that would be something we would include, is, just a scope across Maryland. What have we seen as a result of these reviews and lessons learned and things of that nature? So that's a good point. Absolutely.
It also does make me think of our report card website includes a feature where it's called Similar Schools, in which schools are grouped, say 20 to 30 schools that have similar demographics. So we might be able to utilize that to get at your point of, like, which schools have similar student populations.
Thank you.
Oh, Vice Chair Kerwin?
Yes, you may have said, but I missed it. The team will write a report, and the report goes to various bodies, entities. Will there be any response to that report? Will there be anything that says what the school did as a result of the report?
Currently, that's not written into the plan. But we should think about that. And Rachel, we should have a conversation in one of our meetings, like so there will be ongoing over the next 10 years, right? We have to get into observe schools, and for those schools that are continuing not to show progress, get out more frequently. So we haven't had that long-term, 3 to 5 years, or what happens after year one, in terms of follow-up monitoring. I can only speak putting my LEA hat off. If I was a superintendent or a principal supervisor and looking at the strategic plan of the system, how am I taking the feedback from the expert review team process and embedding it into the strategic plan for the district to make improvements in a coherent way, so that we're monitoring progress based on actionable data. So that might be a strategy that the LEAs definitely should consider. Going back and checking if they've implemented any of the recommendations into their plan is not something that we've written out or made an expectation. So that would be something that we should go back and follow up on. Very good question.
I just follow up with Dr. Curran's question, because that gets to the heart of what I was talking about earlier. To the degree that could be known that you don't have to, because you select them at random, that you are actively engaged in doing the expert review, that you've gotten that feedback, and knowing that you're not going to get to some of these schools for a long period of time, if they knew and had some assessment available to them, they would start making corrective actions long before you actually got to their individual schools. So that's important, that that feedback be shared and disseminated to the degree as possible, so that people will start making corrective action long before you actually get to their schools. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I worry that, we go through this process, school gets these recommendations, and then they don't have to respond to the recommendations. So I think the process needs to include a written response from what the school intends to do as a result of the report. So
Yeah.
I knew it may not be possible for this round, but it's something I would strongly urge be considered in future years.
Thank you. All right, anything else, Dr. Collins?
Member Lynch does have her hand up.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm just wondering if there will, if there's an opportunity for the AIB to actually shadow, one of these visits.
If not, we can make that happen.
I know Rachel Amstead did attend the training in the summer. And also we collaborated on a portion of the training to train the reviewers on the blueprint. So that option is always open for sure. And I think the other part to, determining whether or not the recommendations were implemented, as well as the role, looking at the role of the ERT right now is noted as an advisory. They have more of an advisory role. So, I think this will be a good discussion for us to have moving forward, is the monitoring of
I wasn't
implementation.
implying that they had to do them, because it is advisory, but we ought to at least know whether or not they did.
Mhm. Yeah. Point well taken. Thank you.
Any further questions, Mr. Executive Director?
Yes, Member Doss.
Yeah, and just a clarification, it is open for the AIB or members to actually shadow?
I don't see why not. Rachel, and we can again talk in our upcoming meeting, Rachel, of how we want to make that happen. But again, it was helpful this summer when we had AIB staff participate in the training. So I think that would be helpful. Unless there are any issues with shadowing.
Set up further. We got the request in, so we'll figure out how to accommodate that later if there were further question about it. Okay. All right, Dr. Collins, thank you so very much and your team for the vast amount of work that you guys have done. We've gotten some follow-ups that we were going to work through with our executive director, and hopefully we can incorporate much of what we've talked about today as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
So at this point, the AIB staff is recommending that we follow up with MSDE around the various comments that have been made today and some of the outstanding items that we've requested and asked MSDE to make revisions, formal revisions to their plan and the documents that were submitted for approval that reflect the discussions that we've had. And so what we're recommending at this point is that that the board give conditional approval to the expert review team plan for the school year, and that you delegate to myself and the AIB staff to follow up with MSDE to incorporate the revisions that have been discussed, follow up on also discussions of what's come up today.
Yeah, let me interrupt with, the
Yeah.
reason we want it this way is because we need to get this response back before we have an opportunity to formally meet. And this will allow us an opportunity to transition this in a way that will facilitate the concerns that you heard today, some of the recommendations that the staff is already making. And I think that they can incorporate all of those in and allow the executive director and staff to work out the final details of this. So that's basically what is before us at this point in time, correct?
Yes, and because the next board meeting is in September, and for the visits to actually begin in October, if possible, we would like to be able to approve their documents before the September meeting.
All right, well, I'll turn and put that in the form of a motion for us to discuss. So I'm going to move that we approve the process outlined by our executive director, following with the questions and comments that we've had today, and work out the final details to the degree that there may be some additional ones. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second the motion, but I do have a question.
Yeah, we're gonna have a discussion at this point. The motion is now before us. Any comments or question on the motion?
Yeah, Rachel, you mentioned you were going to it's conditional approval on making some revisions and including the discussion today. Well, there's so many different things that were said today. How do we know what is going to be in what revisions based on today are you going to suggest?
Well, let's go back. One of the things that we can do, Dr. Curran, is to have a written summary of that and to include that so to circulate it to the board so that
That's where I was headed. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where I was headed. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes.
Are any other questions or comments on the motion that's on the table for us at this point in time? Hope that everybody understands it now that we're going to have conditional approval, but there are a number of questions that we raised today and comments that the board made, and we would like to incorporate that into the final approval, and the staff will do that and circulate around to us and get your additional comments or questions that you may have as it relates to that. That's the motions on the table. I see no additional comments or questions. Hands up.
Yeah,
I'm
I have,
sorry.
and I guess,
Mr. Manco?
yeah, I think this is just so delicate because I understand the sense of having additional conditions that I think were surfaced based on the conversation today, and that makes sense. I'm also sensitive to what Chair Leggett brought up about, not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, and, just trying to, find this sweet spot between like providing enough feedback so that we have a better product, but also, not getting kind of caught in this morass of back and forth as we try to, continue to kind of hone a process that, to me, it seems like is already very, very delayed. And at some point we just need to, put in an action, and a part of that will, through that process, we'll figure out, if there's not enough classroom visits, if there's, if there's too many focus group visits, if there's more team members that are needed, I think some of this, we have to let the process take place before we can understand better what are the additional conditions that are needed in order to make the process better.
I agree with that, and part of this will include those factors, but you get an opportunity to look at what we're talking about today. But if we don't move today, then we would certainly allow the process to be held up and when I get started in October. So this is the way to accommodate essentially what you're talking about, and then continue to revise it as we go forward. There are additional questions up, hands or comments? If not, we're ready for the motion. All in favor of the motion so stated, please indicate by raising your hands. Somebody to count in there.
Yep, that's all 7.
All right, thank you. Any additional comments, Madam Executive Director?
In the interest of time, we can skip the executive director report. There's nothing urgent there. And I can very quickly talk about the last item, which relates to the revised regulations that MSDE has proposed related to teacher preparation and teacher licensure. And as you'll recall, the AIB provided comments on the proposed regulations last spring. MSDE and the PSTEB have worked to address many of those comments, and the regulations were published recently, and the public comment period is now open until August 14th. So in general, the revised regulations did incorporate many of the comments that the AIB suggested. And as you recall, we also had a public hearing. We took public input and we incorporated that feedback into our comments. And so many of those provisions are included in the proposed regulations. There are a few items that are not in the proposed regulations that we would offer comment on. One of which is the regulations do now state that for the teacher practicum, which you may recall the original regulations required 180 days, the AIB recommended that they use the statutory language, which is equivalent to a full school year, and that is what the regulations now say. We had also recommended that they provide some criteria around the types of experiences and skills that undergraduate teacher candidates should be exposed to during that practicum that does not need to be consecutive in one time period across their schooling, in terms of diverse classroom settings, different types of student learners, and different times of the school year, to get a real experience of what the full being a teacher is like for the full year. That is not included in the proposed regulations, so that would be one comment that we would offer to send into MSDE. Another example is they have made significant changes to the mentor teacher section of the regulations that was responsive to the public feedback and the AIB's feedback. But in some places they're fairly, the language is open-ended and could allow for varying implementation across the state. Sort of, for example, a highly competent teacher demonstrated by evidence of impacting student achievement, sort of. And so in some of these cases, we would suggest that there be like some specific options that LEAs could choose from in implementing that criteria, but that it not be completely open-ended and left to just the judgment of each essentially principal or even someone else in the school. So that's another example of a comment that we would like to offer back to MSDE. And then most of the other provisions are items that don't necessarily need to be incorporated into the regulations now, but things for them to consider in future regulations. And an example of this is there's a whole many pages of regulations around the new professional development point system. And we provided feedback last year that those ultimately, those regulations will need to be revised to incorporate the career ladder and the blueprints vision that professional development is more embedded in the school day and less of a separate experience. And so that's another example of some of the input that we would recommend that we provide back to MSDE. But overall, the regulations they've made a lot of very good changes to the regulations, and they are fairly well aligned with what the AIB had proposed.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So the motion would be to actually let me look at what it actually says. To direct the executive director on the behalf of the AIB to submit public comment to MSDE consistent with the staff recommendations that were made.
I so move.
Second.
Yes, motion moved and properly second. The executive director's comments and that we move accordingly. Any questions or comments related to the question that's now on the table for discussion? Hearing none? I'm sorry.
I was just gonna provide a appreciation for the staff for staying up on top of that.
Thank you. All right, no further question? All in favor, please indicate by raising your hands.
That is 7.
Thank you. All right, anything further, Ms. Executive Director?
No, that is it.
All right. Well, again, let me thank everyone for a very healthy discussion today on some very important items. We've given some instruction for our executive directors and others to follow in direction so that we can be on schedule for October. Our next meeting is scheduled for
September 21st at 1 o'clock.
Okay. All right. No further comments or questions that I hear. Entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and properly second. We join. All in favor, please indicate by raising your hands. Okay.
All 7.
We're adjourned. Oh, I need to talk to you and Britt for a second about tomorrow. For about 5 minutes. On
Okay.
phone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.